The Quran uses stories as a means of teaching and moral guidance. For instance, the stories of the prophets are narratives aimed at conveying lessons. Ayat al-Kursi. Although not directly related to a story, this verse is considered one of the most powerful in the Quran, emphasizing the greatness and sovereignty of Allah. Allah, there is no deity except Him, the ever-living, the sustainer of all existence. Neither drowsiness overtakes Him nor sleep. To Him belongs whatever is in the heavens and whatever is on the earth. Who is it that can intercede with Him except by His permission? He knows what is presently before them and what will be after them, and they encompass not a thing of His knowledge except for what He wills. His Kursi extends over the heavens and the earth, and their preservation tires Him not, and He is the Most High, the Most Great. Quran 2, 255. If wabak was intended to refer to something else, please clarify or correct the term, and I can provide more specific information based on actual Quranic terms or stories. Verses related to pandemics. Surah Al-Baqarah 2, 155, 157. And we will surely test you with something of fear and hunger, and a loss of wealth and lives and fruits, but give good tidings to the patient, who, when disaster strikes them, say, "Indeed we belong to Allah, and indeed to Him we will return." Those are the ones upon whom are blessings from their Lord and mercy, and it is those who are the rightly guided. These verses suggest that trials, including pandemics, are part of the human experience to test patience and faith. Surah Al-An'am 642. And we have already sent messengers to nations before you, O Muhammad. Then we seized them with poverty and hardship, that perhaps they might humble themselves to us. This verse indicates that afflictions like pandemics might be sent to encourage repentance and humility. Surah Al-Araf 794. And we sent not to a city any prophet except that we seized its people with adversity and hardship, that they might humble themselves. Here the concept of a widespread calamity is used as a means to bring communities back to faith or to test their resilience. Stories in the Quran. The story of Prophet Lot. While not directly about a pandemic, the destruction of the people of Lut due to their moral corruption can be paralleled with divine punishment narratives that could include pandemics. Surah Hud 11:81-83 discusses how Lut warned his people, and their subsequent punishment was a severe disaster, which could be seen as a metaphor for the societal breakdown a pandemic might cause. The story of Prophet Moses and the plagues. Although this is more about the plagues sent to Egypt, it's relevant as it shows how diseases and afflictions were used as divine signs. Surah Al-Araf 7, 130, 136 describes various plagues sent to Pharaoh and his people as a sign of divine power and punishment for their oppression of the Israelites. The Prophet Muhammad's guidance on plagues. While not a story from the Quran itself, the Hadith sayings of the Prophet Muhammad provides guidance relevant to pandemics. The Prophet Muhammad advised not to enter a land where there is a plague, nor to leave one if you are already there, indicating an early form of quarantine or containment strategy. This is often discussed in Islamic jurisprudence concerning pandemics. Interpretation and guidance. Islamic guidance on epidemics. Islamic teachings emphasize cleanliness, quarantine, and seeking medical treatment alongside reliance on prayer and divine mercy in times of epidemic diseases. The Quran encourages Muslims to turn back to Allah in times of trial, seek His mercy, and be patient. Pandemics as tests. The Quran's narrative often frames such events as tests of faith, patience, and community solidarity. The response to these challenges can lead to spiritual growth or conversely serve as a warning or punishment for those who stray from the path of righteousness. Remember, while these verses and stories offer spiritual guidance and perspective, they are not medical advice. Muslims are advised to follow both spiritual guidance and modern medical practices in dealing with pandemics. Islamic medical ethics is a branch of ethics that integrates Islamic moral and legal principles with the practice of medicine and healthcare. Here's an overview based on the principles, practices, and teachings from Islamic sources. Principles of Islamic medical ethics. Sanctity of life. Life is considered sacred in Islam, and its preservation is a fundamental ethical duty. This is emphasized in the Quran with verses like, "Whoever saves one life, it is as if he had saved mankind entirely." Quran 5:32. This principle underpins the ethical obligation to provide healthcare and to avoid actions that might lead to the unnecessary loss of life. Beneficence, ihsan. Doing good and promoting welfare is a core value. Physicians are expected to act in the best interest of their patients, which includes providing the best possible care. Non-maleficence, ladara waladira. The principle of not causing harm is central, mirroring the Hippocratic Oath. This includes avoiding treatments that might cause unnecessary pain or suffering. Justice, ADL. Fair treatment and equitable distribution of healthcare resources are emphasized. This includes not discriminating against patients based on any personal characteristics and ensuring access to medical care for all, especially the vulnerable. Autonomy versus beneficence. While autonomy is acknowledged, there's a nuanced approach where the physician's role in guiding the patient towards what is beneficial might take precedence over purely autonomous decision-making, especially if the patient's choices conflict with Islamic ethical norms or could lead to harm. Methodology, Sharia, Islamic law. Medical ethics in Islam is an extension of Sharia, based on the Quran, Hadith, sayings and actions of Prophet Muhammad, and the consensus of Islamic scholars, Ijma. Legal reasoning, ijtihad, is employed to address new medical issues not explicitly covered in traditional texts. Fatwas, religious rulings. Contemporary issues in medicine often lead to the issuance of fatwas by Islamic scholars to guide Muslim practitioners and patients. These rulings can cover topics from organ donation to reproductive technologies. Key teachings: care for the sick. Visiting the sick and providing medical care is considered a form of charity and worship in Islam. Confidentiality. Patient confidentiality is highly valued, akin to the modern concept of medical confidentiality. Informed consent. While autonomy is respected, consent must be informed, and decisions should align with Islamic ethical standards. End-of-life care. Euthanasia is generally forbidden, but pain relief and comfort care are encouraged. The preservation of life is paramount, but there's acknowledgement of the natural process of death without aggressive interventions when recovery is impossible. Reproductive ethics. Issues like IVF are debated with considerations for the sanctity of marriage, lineage, and the welfare of the child. Organ donation varies by scholar. Some see it as an act of saving life, while others have restrictions based on ensuring the donor's death is certain before organ removal. Modern applications, bioethics. Committees. Many Muslim majority countries have established committees that integrate Islamic ethics with modern medical practice to address new ethical challenges. Education. There's an increasing focus on educating Muslim medical professionals about Islamic bioethics alongside Western bioethical principles. Global context. With Muslim populations worldwide, Islamic medical ethics also influences healthcare delivery in non-Muslim countries, promoting culturally sensitive care. Islamic medical ethics thus not only guide Muslim healthcare providers, but also inform policy, patient care, and ethical debate within the broader Muslim community globally. The year is 1644, a year that would be etched into the annals of history as a turning point for China. The Ming Dynasty, once a beacon of stability and prosperity, crumbles under the weight of its own decay. Corruption and mismanagement have weakened the once mighty empire, leaving it vulnerable to both internal and external threats. Rebellions rage across the land, discontented peasants driven to desperation by heavy taxation and famine rise up in arms. The social fabric of the nation is torn apart as local warlords and bandit leaders seize the opportunity to carve out their own territories. Natural disasters compound the suffering. Floods, droughts, and famines ravage the countryside, leaving the population struggling to survive. Crops fail, and food becomes scarce, leading to widespread hunger and malnutrition. Amidst this chaos, a new threat emerges: pestilence. Diseases, both old and new, spread rapidly through the weakened population, finding fertile ground in the overcrowded and unsanitary conditions of the cities and refugee camps. Epidemics, harbingers of death, sweep through the ravaged land. The plague, smallpox, and other deadly diseases claim countless lives, further destabilizing the already fragile society. Cities already teetering on the brink descend into full-blown catastrophe. Infrastructure crumbles, and the once bustling urban centers become ghost towns, haunted by the specter of death and decay. The stench of death permeates the air. Mass graves and funeral pyres become a common sight as the bodies of the deceased pile up, overwhelming the capacity of the living to bury their dead. Millions perish, their cries lost in the maelstrom. Families are torn apart and entire communities are wiped out, leaving behind a landscape of grief and desolation. From the ashes of this devastation rises the Qing Dynasty. The Manchu conquerors, seizing the moment of weakness, sweep down from the north and establish their rule over the shattered remnants of the Ming Empire. The Manchu conquerors, hailing from the north, impose their rule over a land scarred by chaos. They bring with them new customs, new governance, and a new era. But the scars of the past remain deeply etched in the collective memory of the people. They inherit a society grappling with the aftermath of unimaginable suffering, a society forever marked by the specter of disease. The new rulers face the monumental task of rebuilding and healing a nation that has been brought to its knees. The 1640s serve as a chilling reminder. They reveal the fragility of human existence and the thin veneer of civilization that can so easily be torn apart by the forces of nature and human folly. They reveal the fragility of human existence. The events of this decade underscore the precariousness of life and the ever-present threat of disaster that can upend even the most stable of societies. They underscore the capricious nature of fate. The fortunes of empires and the lives of individuals alike are subject to the whims of fate, reminding us of the limits of human control over our destiny. And they set the stage for a centuries-long struggle against the invisible enemy, infectious disease. The lessons learned during this tumultuous period would shape the future of Chinese society, influencing medical practices, public health policies, and the collective consciousness for generations to come. Imagine a world without modern medicine, a world where the simplest of ailments could spiral into a life-threatening condition, a world where a cough could be a death sentence and where the understanding of disease was shrouded in mystery and fear. This was the reality for the people of late Imperial China. In an era where scientific knowledge was limited and medical resources were scarce, the threat of epidemics loomed large over everyday life. Epidemics were not just biological events. They were social and cultural upheavals that disrupted the fabric of society. The arrival of a disease could turn bustling markets into ghost towns and transform vibrant communities into places of fear and suspicion. Faced with the relentless onslaught of disease, ordinary people turned to a tapestry of beliefs and practices. Traditional Chinese medicine, with its roots in ancient philosophy, offered a blend of herbal remedies and holistic approaches to health. Amulets and talismans promised protection from malevolent spirits. These objects, often imbued with symbolic meanings, were believed to ward off illness and bring good fortune. Traditional healers, revered in their communities, dispensed herbal remedies passed down through generations. These remedies, crafted from a variety of plants and minerals, were believed to restore balance and harmony within the body. Religious rituals offered solace and a plea for divine intervention. Temples became sanctuaries where people sought the favor of deities, hoping for protection and healing. Fear, often irrational but entirely understandable, gripped communities. The unknown nature of diseases and their seemingly random spread created an atmosphere of anxiety and dread. Rumors spread like wildfire, fueling suspicion and prejudice. In the absence of scientific explanations, people turned to superstition and hearsay, often blaming outsiders or marginalized groups for the spread of disease. The sick were often ostracized, left to fend for themselves in makeshift quarantine zones. These areas, hastily constructed and poorly managed, became places of isolation and despair. Desperation drove some to extreme measures, seeking solace in superstition and folk remedies. From burning incense to chanting incantations, people clung to any hope of relief. Yet amidst the despair, glimmers of hope emerged. Communities bound by shared suffering found strength in unity. Neighbors helped each other, sharing food, medicine, and comfort. Communities rallied together, pooling resources to care for the sick and maintain sanitation. Efforts to clean streets, dispose of waste, and purify water sources became communal responsibilities. Local officials, often overwhelmed but not uncaring, implemented rudimentary public health measures. These included quarantine protocols, travel restrictions, and the establishment of temporary hospitals. The human spirit, though battered, refused to be broken. Resilience and determination shone through as communities rebuilt and recovered, learning from each epidemic and striving to be better prepared for the next. As epidemics ravaged China, keen observers began to question the prevailing narratives. The country was no stranger to the devastating impacts of widespread disease, and the toll it took on communities was immense. Families were torn apart and entire villages were decimated. The traditional explanations, deeply rooted in cultural and spiritual beliefs, were increasingly seen as insufficient in the face of such relentless suffering. Traditional explanations rooted in moral and cosmic imbalances no longer sufficed. These beliefs, which had been passed down through generations, suggested that epidemics were a form of divine punishment or a result of cosmic disharmony. However, as the death toll rose and the suffering continued unabated, a growing number of thinkers began to seek alternative explanations. They turned to the natural world, hoping to find answers that could lead to more effective interventions. A new breed of thinkers emerged, seeking answers in the natural world. These early scientists and physicians were driven by a desire to understand the true nature of disease and to find ways to combat it. They meticulously observed their surroundings, noting patterns and anomalies that could provide clues. Their work laid the foundation for a more scientific approach to medicine, one that relied on evidence and observation rather than superstition and tradition. One such figure was Chen Qide, a physician who lived through the devastating smallpox epidemic of the 1640s. Chen Qide's experiences during this time profoundly shaped his views on disease and its transmission. He witnessed firsthand the suffering caused by smallpox, and he was determined to find a way to alleviate it. His observations and writings would become a cornerstone of early epidemiological thought in China. In his writings, he challenged the notion that epidemics were solely divine retribution. Chen Qide meticulously documented the symptoms and progression of smallpox, providing detailed accounts of its impact on the human body. He noted that the disease seemed to spread from person to person, suggesting that it was caused by a contagious agent rather than a supernatural force. This was a radical departure from the prevailing beliefs of his time, and it marked a significant step forward in the understanding of infectious diseases. He meticulously documented the symptoms and progression of the disease, suggesting that it spread through a contagious agent. His detailed observations included descriptions of the characteristic pustules that appeared on the skin, the high fever that accompanied the illness, and the various stages of the disease's progression. Chen Qide's work provided valuable insights into the nature of smallpox and laid the groundwork for future research into its transmission and prevention. Another pioneering figure was Mr. Shen, a scholar who witnessed firsthand the horrors of the 1790s epidemic. Like Chen Qide, Mr. Shen was deeply affected by the suffering he saw around him, and he was determined to find a way to prevent such tragedies in the future. His work would further advance the field of epidemiology and contribute to a growing body of knowledge about the causes and transmission of infectious diseases. He rejected the prevailing belief that miasma, or bad air, was the primary culprit. The miasma theory, which held that diseases were caused by noxious vapors emanating from decaying matter, was widely accepted at the time. However, Mr. Shen's observations led him to question this theory. He noted that people who had no direct contact with the supposed sources of miasma were still falling ill, suggesting that another factor was at play. Instead, he proposed that tiny, invisible insects, too small for the naked eye to see, might be responsible for transmitting disease. This was a groundbreaking hypothesis, as it suggested that diseases could be spread by living organisms, rather than by environmental factors alone. Mr. Shen's idea was ahead of its time, and it would take many years for the scientific community to fully appreciate its significance. Nevertheless, his work represented an important step forward in the understanding of infectious diseases. These early epidemiologists, though limited by the scientific knowledge of their time, made groundbreaking observations. Their willingness to question established beliefs and to seek out new explanations for the phenomena they observed was a testament to their intellectual curiosity and their commitment to advancing medical knowledge. Their work laid the foundation for the modern field of epidemiology and helped to pave the way for future discoveries. They dared to challenge dogma, paving the way for a more rational and evidence-based approach to understanding epidemics. Their efforts to document and analyze the spread of disease, to identify potential causes, and to propose new theories were instrumental in shifting the focus of medical research from superstition to science. This shift was not without its challenges, as many of their ideas were met with skepticism and resistance. However, their persistence and dedication ultimately led to significant advancements in the field. Their insights, though largely forgotten for centuries, stand as a testament to the power of human curiosity and the enduring quest to unravel the mysteries of disease. The work of Chen Qide and Mr. Shen and their contemporaries laid the groundwork for future generations of scientists and researchers. Their contributions to the field of epidemiology, though not always recognized in their own time, have had a lasting impact on our understanding of infectious diseases and our ability to combat them. Their legacy serves as a reminder of the importance of questioning established beliefs, seeking out new knowledge, and never ceasing in the pursuit of scientific discovery. Late Imperial Epidemiology, Part 1, From Retrospective Diagnosis to Epidemics as Diagnostic Lens for Other Ends, 1870s to 1970s. The beginning of the 1640s marked a precipitous fall into chaos. In the wake of rebellions, Parsons' 1970, and war, locusts and famine, floods and epidemics, husbands left their wives, parents abandoned their children, and worse. Under the omens and anomalies, Xiangyi section of the Gazetteer of Tongxiang County, the scholar Chen Qide provided an account of the local situation in 1641 titled Record of Disasters and Famines, Zai Wang Jishi Zai Huang Jishu. He wrote, if not from war, one died from famine. If not from famine, one died from epidemics. Point 1. Responses to epidemics around this time varied by sectors of society. The government sometimes set up centers to distribute medicines using the model of grain stations for famine relief. Will 1990. That harkens back to Mencius, who argued that blaming poor harvests rather than governance for famine was no different from blaming the weapon rather than its bearer for killing someone. Lao, 1970, 52. Some temples organized ceremonies every 3 years to appease the epidemic gods, Shipper, 1985, or carried out community rituals to expel epidemic-carrying demons, Katz, 1995. During the waning years of the Ming Dynasty, local elites responded to long-term imperial neglect of actual medical relief during epidemics by increasing privately supported efforts at the local level. Leung, 1987, 139, 1997. Officials continued to tabulate epidemics across the country, Imura, 1936-37, while some local scholars recorded what they observed in more detail. Chen further wrote, for example, that previous famines could usually be counted by the prefecture or by the province, but this one severely affected not only Zhejiang and the southern capital, Nanjing, but also as far north as the capital, Beijing, and as far south as Guangdong. Chen proposed two causes for this catastrophe. The first appealed to a concept of divine population control. Is it that heaven created too many people, so it spread this first scourge? The second blamed human greed. Or is it because the people have already consumed so much that heaven hates and discards them to such a degree? Human indulgence, Chen concluded, had caused the people to stray from the correct way, the ultimate cause of the famine and epidemics of 1641. If only they could always regard rice as they do pearls and wood as they do cassia, he pondered, then the bad qualities in their hearts would never develop. Point 2. Famine and war were the only environmental elements Chen recognized as contributing to the rise of epidemics. He did not mention poor living conditions, polluted water, the weakened constitutions of the impoverished, or the greater susceptibility of one group of people compared to another. Chen's explanation and solution remain within a conventional cosmo-moralistic framework, in which heaven sends floods, droughts, famines and epidemics as just divine retribution for excessive human indulgence and corrupt court politics. Hansen, 1997, 117-22. A man known only as Mr. Shen also wrote about the early 1640s epidemics in Zhejiang province. 3. Instead of the broader political moral context, he focused on the steady decline in the local economy and social order in Gui'an County from 1640 up through the autumn of 1643.4 first. There was flooding from a serious downpour in July, whereupon hoodlums, that is refugees, banded together in groups of 3 to FDV demanding food. The local economy shut down as neighborhoods discontinued markets and villagers closed their doors. Finally, a new county magistrate captured the leader of the bandits, that is, refugees, and calmed the people. However, the fields were still too wet to plant new rice sprouts until the end of July. During this time, the cost of apikul, dongshurs of rice, or about 60 kilograms, reached 1 tael 5/6 copper cash, the equivalent of just over 2 ounces of silver, 5. The following year, 1641, the village of Huangmei suffered a drought. It did not rain that spring or summer until July 16. Only 1 to 2/10 of the total crop of rice was planted, but the shoots planted after the July rain did not survive the cold of the fall and an early frost. A picul of rice jumped to more than twice the price of the previous year, to 3 tael 5/6 copper cash, almost 5 ounces, 4.9 ounces, of silver. Shen recorded that at this point people began to die of starvation or resort to cannibalism to survive. A big snowstorm on the first day of the next year, 1642, was taken initially as a good omen for the next year's harvest. Instead, a major epidemic swept through the region. Shen estimated that by the summer solstice, the epidemic had affected 8 of 10 households and sometimes wiped out entire families. Meanwhile, the government made the lives of the people worse by refusing to give them tax relief. Although in 1643 crops were successfully planted, when the farmers were about to plant their second crop, a massive flood turned the levied areas into ponds. The gazetteer entry directly following Shen's account records that the famine in that year was so severe that people again resorted to cannibalism. In the spring of 1644, another major epidemic struck similar to the one 2 years before, but this time with victims vomiting blood before they died. In contrast to Chen's moral political interpretation, Shen located the cause of the epidemics in severe famines, worsened by excessive government taxes. As was the convention, he used the price of rice to gauge the severity of the famine and attributed these disasters to taxation on the one hand and crop failure due to vicissitudes of nature on the other. His concluding questions, who will pay the state taxes this year and how will the debts be paid, reflect the primary concerns of the rural elite whose views he represented. In the autumn of 1642 in neighboring Jiangsu province, the physician Wu Yuxing, c. 1582-1652, substantiated Chen Qide's account of the same year, that the epidemic had spread throughout the country, both north and south. In the preface to his treatise on febrile epidemics, Wenyilun, 1642, Wu wrote that the epidemics worsened in the 5th and 6th lunar months of 1641, until everyone in entire households infected each other. 7. The epidemic the previous year had swept through Shandong, Zhejiang, Hebei, northern Jiali, Beijing region, and southern Jili, Nanjing region. Wu, however, did not speculate about moral or cosmological causes like Chen, or political or economic causes like Shen. Rather, he sought a natural cause in the environment. Wu also did not look back to the 1580s and 1630s epidemics across China, which had probably contributed to the crisis about which he was writing. Instead, he criticized conventional medical treatments. During the initial onset, fashionable practitioners erroneously used cold damage methods to treat the disorder. I never saw a case of theirs that did not get worse. Some patients and their families mistakenly heeded the claims that by the 7th or 14th day it would heal itself. Because of this, they were not treated. Some died from not being treated in time or not taking the medicine in time. Others wrongly took drastic formulas and by not following the normal sequence for attacking and then replenishing, died. Hansen 2011, 91-8. If some doctors were too aggressive, Wu thought others were too timid, using mild, slow-working drugs for acute symptoms, prolonging the suffering. These inadequacies prompted him to attack the focus on climate that dominated traditional Chinese epidemiology up to that time, with an argument that deviant qi liqi, pestilential qi, liki liqi, and other non-climatic factors caused these epidemics. Qi 1981, Xiao 1987. Starting from the first sentence of the preface to his treatise, Wu moved from the traditional medical view of correspondence between seasonal cycles and human illness to his new view of a specific kind of anomalous qi, zaki za qi, separate from normal changes in seasonal qi. The pathology of warm epidemics is not that of wind, cold, summer heat, or damp chai. Rather, it is stimulated by a type of anomalous qi in nature lit. Heaven and earth, tiandi tiandi. There are 9 stages of transmission. These are the critical junctures for treating epidemic disorders. Why is it that from antiquity to the present no one has ever discovered faming this? Hansen 2011, 94.5. Wu then argued that while his medical colleagues thought they were seeing cases of cold damage, Shanghan, in fact they were mostly dealing with what he called epidemics of warm diseases, Wenbing. Warm disease is an umbrella term comparable to the modern-day concept of acute febrile diseases in that it encompassed a range of symptoms and epidemiological phenomenon, such as an illness spreading broadly and indiscriminately throughout a large population, that today would fall under acute infectious diseases. This Chinese disease concept, however, was first defined during the Han Dynasty, 202 BCE, 220 CE, within a configurationist perspective that emphasized that something in the environment had become pathogenic. Generally, this perspective means that something in the environment, a configuration of cold or hot air, weather, climate, mists, etc., caused the outbreak, thus accounting for the fact that many people became sick at the same time with comparable symptoms in class cycle Chinese medicine. The external causes were seasonal pathogenic factors such as cold or hot seasonal qi, Hansen 2011, 16-17. This is in contrast to a contaminationist perspective that emphasizes human-to-human transmission via some kind of pathogen or contaminant. Both perspectives depended on a third predispositionist perspective that explained why some people do not become sick, others do but recover, and still others perish. Rosenberg 1992a 195-6. Because literate Chinese physicians were trained to think in terms of macro-microcosm relationships, one scholar has argued that they were more weather-conscious than contagion-conscious, Kuriyama 2000. Though conceptions of contagion certainly circulated among the populace at the same time, and had a complex history within classical Chinese medicine as well. Lung 2010, Lu 2021, Chapter 14 in this volume. Nonetheless, while the characteristic febrile symptoms of what were called warm factor epidemics, Wenyi, did not change much over time, interpretations of their etiology, best therapeutic interventions, and appropriate institutional responses changed dramatically from the pre-modern period up through the 2002-2003 SARS epidemic, Hansen 2010. What was the disease? Although there is no question that widespread epidemics occurred in the early 1640s, the question about what caused them remains. From Chen's moral argument and Shen's political economic analysis to medical debates about whether the epidemics were actually cold damage or warm diseases or due to pathogenic climatic qi or as yet unidentified anomalous qi not related to the weather, it is clear that contemporaries had wide-ranging opinions on the subject. Over 400 years later, although medical historians concur that the end of Ming epidemics contributed to the Ming's fall, Zhao 2004, they still remain divided on what caused them, albeit on very different conceptual foundations and in the context of the broader Epidemiology of infectious diseases in the Ming-Qing period, Fan Ka-wai et al. 2005. While one historian concluded that their cause was a mystery, Elvin 1973, others argued that mostly bubonic plague and, in some causes, even pneumonic plague was definitely the main cause. Chow 1997. Cow and Lee 2006, though others noted that dysentery, typhoid and malaria were also present, May and Yan 1996. Still others insist that bubonic plague cannot be conclusively determined in a context within which not only were other diseases occurring simultaneously, but also at a time when historical actors' concepts of disease did not neatly ft one-to-one correspondences with modern-day disease concepts. Dunstan 1975, Benedict 1996a, 1996b, 1996c, Hansen 1997-2011. So what caused the late Ming epidemics? The present chapter on late Imperial Epidemiological OGI in China, Part 1, uses this question as a heuristic device to write a broader historiography of epidemics in China and traditional Chinese epidemiology up through the 1970s. First, I present two diametrically opposite approaches to the history of disease that have emerged since the 1970s in the medical history practiced in European American institutions. One scholar has coined the terms naturalist realist and historicalist conceptualist to represent the two sides of the broader historical debate, Wilson 2000. Since these two approaches have also largely shaped the medical historiography of China from the late 19th century up to the present, next, I sketch a historiography of the naturalist-realist method of retrospective epidemiology that dominated treatments of the historical evidence of epidemics in China from the 1870s to the 1930s. Third, I classify scholarship on epidemics in China between the 1940s and 1970s into two disciplinary trajectories. On the one hand, economic and social historians largely concerned about epidemics with respect to demographic transformations in the past, and on the other hand, anthropologists focused on current social and religious responses to epidemics. Despite the different questions scholars sought to answer based on extant records of past epidemics or their observations of contemporary Chinese responses to them, both types of scholars nonetheless crafted answers to their questions within a shared natural realist framework. Two approaches to the history of disease. Answering the question of what caused the late Ming epidemics thus depends on how one approaches them. Should we cast out Chen's human greed and Shen's excessive taxation along with Wu's anomalous qi in favor of a list of modern biomedical disease categories that could have caused these epidemics? To do so requires drawing retrospective diagnoses based on modern disease concepts from historical sources on epidemics recorded within very different linguistic realms and cultural frames. Here, the distinction in cultural anthropology between emic and etic viewpoints is instructive. The emic view is the insider's perspectives, how subjects perceive things, and so whatever distinctions are meaningful within their society. The etic view is the outsider's perspectives, how observers analyze things in another culture, and so whatever analytical concepts they found meaningful to interpret any given society. The emic view, for example, would value the responses of Chen, Shen, and Wu within their historical milieus. The etic view, by contrast, would use the sources they wrote as evidence to make retrospective diagnoses of the cause of the epidemics according to modern disease concepts. Both approaches are valuable. Historians have dealt with this fundamental contradiction between past and present interpretations of disease experience in different ways. The medical historian Adrian Wilson summarized the two above-mentioned opposing approaches to the history of disease, the naturalist-realist and the historicalist conceptualist, IBID. Efforts to make retrospective diagnoses of past disease experience based on present understanding exemplify what Wilson termed the naturalist-realist approach. What he designated as the historicalist conceptualist approach, by contrast, represents scholarship that takes disease concepts themselves, past and present, as objects of historical analysis. From here on, we will refer to this approach more simply as historical conceptual, and borrow from another scholar's shorthand reference to practitioners of the former as realists and of the latter as historicists, Packard 2016. The realists take the modern disease concept as equivalent to natural reality and thereby seek to connect historical sources about past disease experiences with the present-day modern consensus on disease etiologies. Historicists, by contrast, start from the premise that all knowledge, medical as well as scientific and humanistic, is socially constituted, socially maintained, and dynamic. Knowledge about diseases therefore changes over time, depending on the social consensus that surrounds the phenomena the disease concepts refer to at any given time and place, and constitutes the most reliable kind of information about them. The naturalist-realist position also considers scientific and medical knowledge as transcending social context, whereas the historical conceptual position assumes that even the most stable consensus on somatic disease concepts today have complex socially embedded histories. The naturalist-realist perspective considers that the only relevant past meanings of historical dis-ease concepts are those that fit into a clear trajectory progressing towards a present definition. The historical conceptual perspective, by contrast, examines the consensus-building process that stabilized past as well as current disease concepts. The historicist thus considers ICAL disease concepts relevant on their own terms with their own histories and logic separate from possible modern correlates. Duffin 2005, Packard 2016. Randall Packard 2016 argued in his article Breakbone Fever in Philadelphia 1780, reflections on the history of disease, that although both approaches have been the basis of a rift within the medical history profession in the West since the 1970s, each approach can make distinct contributions to the history of disease. The influential social historian of American medicine Charles Rosenberg famously used the 19th century cholera epidemics in the US as a heuristic device to illuminate major social, political, religious, and economic transformations. Rosenberg, 1962. His essay Toward an Ecology of Knowledge moved the field even more towards the sociology of medicine and science. Ibid, 1979. Just over 20 years later, his co-edited volume Framing Disease established the position that historicizing disease concepts can be just as illuminating of present-day disease concepts that have been conventionally understood within what Wilson later termed the naturalist-realist position, one which Wilson equally considered a cultural construction by situating them as emergent and changing as well within specificity places, institutions and time frames. Rosenberg and Golden, 1992, Packard, 2016. As one of Rosenberg's students, I was also inspired by another one of my advisors, who wrote the essay Topics for Research in Qing History, Naquin and Roski, 1987, and raised epidemics as an important new topic to pursue. It was from this socio-intellectual milieu that my dissertation, Inventing a Tradition in Chinese Medicine, emerged, Hansen, 1997. I also integrated into my analysis of Chinese disease concepts for febrile diseases, however, Andrew Cunningham's critique of retrospective epidemiology. The modern laboratory had so fundamentally changed the identity of infectious diseases, such as plague, that any one-to-one correspondence between modern and past disease concepts was not only futile, but even worse, distorted the past. Cunningham, 1992. David Harley followed suit along these lines in his article on rhetoric and the social construction of sickness and healing, Harley, 1999. Taking the opposite position, Roger Cooter argued in Framing the End of the Social History of Medicine, for what was lost in the shift from the social to cultural history of disease through the framing disease metaphor, especially related to pragmatic research on medical disparities and justice issues, Cooter 2004. Since 2007, however, Rosenberg's Biographies of Disease series, Johns Hopkins University Press monographs, fully represents both sides of this academic spectrum. Speaking of his own book in the series, Packard noted that The Making of a Tropical Disease, A Short History of Malaria, Packard 2007, took the naturalist-realist position, arguing that malaria had existed for centuries as a distinct biological entity, whereas Steve Peitzman's Dropsy Dialysis Transplant, A Short History of Failing Kidneys, Peitzman 2007, traces a historical conceptual history of disease concepts on kidney failure. In 2011, I positioned my first book, Speaking of Epidemics in Chinese Medicine, firmly on the historical conceptual side of the spectrum, Hansen 2011. In the same year, the paleopathologist and physical anthropologist Piers Mitchell published an influential essay that acknowledged the methodological limitations of a retrospective epidemiology that relied on completely different disease concepts from the past. Yet, he also argued that this approach is viable when researchers seek not to equate current disease concepts uncritically with past ones, but rather seek to understand the microorganism itself, how it spread, and who it infected through careful use of historical sources and archaeological evidence. Mitchell 2011, 81-8, Packard 2016, 200. Later, I published an article on the naturalist-realist approach to late Imperial Chinese Epidemiology through a history of the first 50 years of Western medical maps of diseases in China, Hansen 2017. I neither embraced the naturalist-realist position in analyzing these disease maps, nor applied Mitchell's recommendations for studying the transmission paths of microorganisms that these same disease maps were often intended to visualize. Rather, I attempted both to situate the maps within the socio-historical milieu of the authors and publications that produced them, and to interpret their range of rhetorical functions and how these changed over time, revealing new political regimes and intended audiences. Inspired by the scholars synthesizing both sides of the realist-historicist divide in this chapter, I argue, however, that when done judiciously, both approaches to past disease concepts can be productive for understanding late Imperial Chinese epidemiology. Each perspective illuminates very different dimensions of Chinese medical history. Historical conceptual methods are most useful for understanding the social, cultural, and religious contexts within which historical actors' categories and their own disease concepts made sense. However, natural realist methods, when used judiciously, can be productive for answering questions about political, economic, ecological, and demographic transformations. Packard wrote about his own work on diseases in colonial and post-colonial Africa, for example, that he employed the history of disease as a way of illuminating the complex ecological relationships that link social, economic, and biological processes together to produce disease states. Packard, 2016-200. Taking a natural realist approach also allows historians to follow the historical movement of a disease entity across boundaries by controlling for characteristic symptoms, such as the buboes of plague, despite multiple and multivalent disease concepts within one culture and even more variation cross-culturally. Himes, 2014. The modern genetic determination of the Yersinia pestis in combination with the scientific analysis of the remains of plague victims, for example, has opened new pathways of historical and scientific collaboration on the global transmission of plague. Green, 2014. In terms of the historiography of late imperial epidemiology in China, authors applied the naturalist-realist method of retrospective epidemiology well before they applied the historical conceptual approach to analyzing historical actors' categories on their own terms. Part 1 of this essay thus reviews the history of the former, whereas Part 2 addresses the history of the latter. Historiography of retrospective epidemiology in China. Western physicians began to define the diseases of China from the mid-1800s, according to their own medical training, in the newly emergent laboratory-based approach to disease, the method that has most informed the natural realist approach. Some notes on epidemics of this period can be found in the letters of the British official Robert Hart, 1835-1911. While he was Inspector General of the Imperial Maritime Customs Service, IMCS, from 1868 to 1907, Fairbank et al. 1975. He used the new infrastructure of the Customs Service as a clearinghouse for medical reports of disease among foreigners and Chinese alike across China. Some of the earliest examples of the naturalist-realist approach to interpreting epidemics can therefore be found in the 40 years of medical reports in the Customs Gazette published from August 1871 to 1911, Gordon 1884. For the first time, European and American physicians based in China and Japan had a central place to publish their medical observations without limitations in length. The Scottish physician John Dudgeon, 1837-1901, based in Beijing and Tianjin during the last 40 years of his life, wrote several of the earliest medical reports between 1871 and 1875. Dudgeon 1871A, 1871B, 1872A, 1872B, 1875. He also wrote the fourth book focused on the diseases of China, their causes, conditions, and prevalence contrasted with those of Europe, in Dudgeon 1877. This book illustrates well a transition period when British physicians and their Chinese counterparts had more in common conceptually than divided them, especially regarding disease etiology, Rogaski, 2004. Dudgeon even argued, for instance, that the Chinese had a more moderate and healthier diet that Europeans should consider adopting to remedy their dietary and drinking excesses. Lee, 2010a. In the late 1870s and early 1880s, the deepening Western medical consensus on disease classification, nosology, new developments in laboratory science in the direction of isolating causative agents, and related developments in medical statistics helped strengthen a natural, realist interpretation of China's disease concepts. Hansen 2011, 151-2, 2017. Attempts to understand the epidemics spreading across Yunnan in the 1870s particularly exemplify the earliest natural realist lens through which Western observers filtered their observations of China's epidemics. Even before Alexandre Émile Jean Yersin, 1863-1943, for the first time identified under a microscope the specific bacillus that caused plague in his Feld laboratory during the 1894 bubonic plague epidemic in Hong Kong. A French official of the Imperial Chinese Maritime Customs, Émile Rocher, wrote Notes sur la peste au Yunnan about his observations of epidemics of the 1870s during the Muslim-led multi-ethnic Panthay Rebellion, 1856-1873, in Yunnan, Rocher, 1879. Recognizing the significance of Rocher's account for bubonic plague studies, Sir Patrick Manson, 1844-1922, considered the founder of tropical medicine based on research he largely did while living in China. Lee, 2002, 2004, 2012, 2018. Translated into English, most of Rocher's notes sur la peste in his contribution to the medical reports. Manson also included the fast map of the 1871-73 plague epidemics in Yunnan, Manson 1879. A colored version of this map also appears in Rocher's book published the following year. What local Chinese called Yangzibing, a disease characterized by severe itching of skin or pruritus, both Rocher and Manson by this time confidently identified as bubonic plague. Their consensus that the 1870s Yunnan epidemics were one thing, namely bubonic plague, even without laboratory confirmation, also contributed to their ability to map them. The following FFD years of Western maps of the diseases of China, ranging from plague and cholera to beriberi and apoplexy stroke, further represent this natural realist approach. Hansen 2017. The first edition of The Diseases of China, including Formosa and Korea, for example, exemplified the scientific transformations in medicine over the turn of the 19th century, and included national maps of the major diseases of the period according to Western disease classification, Jeffries and Maxwell, 1910. Although the second edition no longer included maps, it brought the first edition up to date with new developments in the natural realist understanding of disease concepts, Jeffries, 1928. Another early representative of the natural realist approach from the 1930s is in Wang and Wu's summary of China's historical epidemiology of plague during their period, 1894-99. In Chapter 10 of their History of Chinese Medicine, being a chronicle of medical happenings in China from ancient times to the present period, Wang and Wu, 1936, 506-37. Titled describing A. the spread of plague in China leading to the Great Outbreak at Canton and Hong Kong in 1894, and B. further consolidation of medical efforts, the AU Thors synthesized the primary sources they relied on to sketch an early history of plague in China. Noting that the chroniclers do not differentiate between the diseases met with, they first make the following clarification. Treating the subject with our present knowledge of epidemics in China, we can rule out a number of these pestilences as having nothing to do with true plague, especially those following in the wake of war, famine, floods, and other catastrophes, which were in all probability typhus and relapsing fever, disease apparently rampant in China from the earliest time. To determine what were true plague cases, they then followed two criteria. A smaller group of outbreaks, on the other hand, seem to have been plague visitations, either because they occurred simultaneously with an established plague pandemic, for example the Black Death, or because they took place in regions where afterwards the existence of frequent plague epidemics or even endemicity was established, for example Mongolia, Shanxi, Wang and Wu, 1936, 506-7. Because Yunnan no longer had plague by the time they wrote their History of Chinese Medicine, Wang and Wu acknowledged the problem of using these earlier sources on the Yunnan epidemics for their history of plague. Because Yunnan was one of the regions now entirely free from plague, but in the past suspected to have been endemic centers, they justified focusing on the region to reconstruct the course of events leading to the 1894 outbreak at Canton and Hong Kong. Wang and Wu, 1936-507. They thereby relied on the earliest AC counts by Rocher and Manson discussed above in their retrospective epidemiology of plague in China. Wu Liantei's other publications on cholera in 1934, Wu et al., 1934. Plague in 1936, Wu 1936a, 1936b. And his autobiography of 1959 similarly represent this natural realist approach to the history of disease in China. Ibid, 1959. Wu was also the first to propose that the even earlier late Yuan epidemics, 1344-45, 1356-60, 1362, were plague despite scarce evidence. Brooke, 2013-65. Also in the 1930s, the Japanese scholar Imura Kozen published tabulations of epidemic diseases listed in local gazetteers for the Ming Dynasty, Imura 1936-37. He thereby established a solid primary source foundation for carrying out retrospective epidemiology as Wang and Wu and their predecessors had exemplified. Because his tabulations preserved all the original disease concepts as they were recorded in the often very terse entries in the local gazetteers, he also made valuable source material more easily accessible for scholars who sought to understand traditional Chinese epidemiology on its own terms using historical conceptual methods, functionalist anthropology and natural realist demography. In the 1940s to 1960s, one sees a related divergence in how scholars interpreted the history of epidemics in China. On the one side, the anthropologist Francis Su wrote a functionalist interpretation of the medical and religious responses that townspeople in Yunnan province took to cholera epidemics in 1942, Su 1952. At that time, Su could assume the identity of the epidemics as cholera, natural realist, in his otherwise more contextual, albeit not historical analysis of religious and scientific responses to the epidemic. Following what had become by then a well-established natural realist line of reasoning, historians of China also started to refer to epidemics in their narratives of major demographic transformations during the 1st to 8th centuries, Bielenstein 1947, and the mid-14th century through mid-20th century, Ho 1959. Within China, researchers published a glossary on the names and symptoms of ancient disease, Yu 1953, and the intellectual history of preventive medicine in China, Fan 1955. From a naturalist-realist perspective, both scholars attempted to make one-to-one translations of historical disease concepts in line with modern ones, stripping away older meanings in the process. Yet, because of the Chinese primary source material provided, their books can be used to understand late Imperial Chinese epidemiology from either side of the spectrum. Another Chinese historian using the naturalist-realist perspective focused on the study of contagious diseases in China, She 1956, and thus considered the late Ming physician Wu Yuxing quoted above as a Chinese expert of contagious disease whose deviant Qi doctrine was comparable to modern germ theory, Ibid 1957. Wu's deviant Qi concept, though, was based within a configurationist, not contaminationist perspective, and so incommensurable with germ theory. Furthermore, all three examples of 1950s Chinese scholarship on late imperial epidemiology are themselves best understood as scholarly responses to the early PRC politicizing of public health, disease prevention, and control of communicable diseases, Scheid 2002, 6772, Rogaski 2004, 2857. Developing these 1950s Chinese precedents, Joseph Needham and Lu Guijin published an article on hygiene and preventive medicine in ancient China, Needham and Lu 1962, and a chapter on records of diseases in ancient China for a book on diseases of antiquity, Ibid 1967. Both publications also fall on the naturalist-realist side of the spectrum, yet also provide useful primary source material for the historical conceptual side. Meanwhile, the Song historian Robert Hartwell integrated records of epidemics and related demographic trends as essential dimensions of his analyses of social and economic transformations during the Song, Hartwell 1967-1982. An outlier in this 1960s scholarship, but no less influential, historian Carl Nathan published a book on plague prevention and politics in Manchuria, 1910-1931, Nathan, 1967. This book set the foundation for further analyses of the relationship between public health, epidemics, and politics through the example of Penang-born, Cambridge University-educated bacteriologist and self-described plague fighter Wu Liante, whom we have already met as an author. Wu had established China's fast public health system in response to the Manchurian pneumonic plague epidemic of 1910-11, a historical thread scholars have picked up again since the early 1990s, Benedict 1993, Floor 1996, Fisher 1995-1996, Gamza 2006, Lay 2010, Summers 2012, Linteris 2016. He is also credited with having co-authored the Fast English History of Chinese Medicine published in 1936, Wang and Wu, 1936, Luesink, 2009. Though by that time they could rely on a foundation of earlier histories of Chinese medicine in Chinese, c. 1935. In the 1970s, new developments in ecological and medical history inspired historians of China to turn their attention to what caused the late Ming epidemics. In an ecological reinterpretation of late Imperial Chinese history, Mark Elvin succinctly summarized the end of Ming epidemiological crisis as follows. In 1586, 89, and 1639-44, China suffered from the two most widespread and lethal epidemics in her recorded history, although their medical nature remains a complete mystery. Elvin, 1973, 310. Based on Imura's data, 1936-37, Elvin sketched the disaster's scope. 92 prefectures and counties across 13 provinces were affected in the 1588-1592 epidemic. 79 prefectures and counties across 10 provinces were affected in 1641. The worst year of the 1640s epidemics. Of the densely populated provinces, only Sichuan and Guangdong escaped. Inspired by Elvin, Helen Dunstan attempted to identify the types of epidemic diseases that spread episodically across China during the last 6 decades of the Ming, following the natural realist approach of retrospective diagnosis. Dunstan, 1975. Although she questioned whether it was possible to make a positive diagnosis, she nonetheless endeavored to make one-to-one correspondences between Chinese disease concepts such as Wenyi Wenyi, febrile epidemics, Wenbing Wenbing, warm disease, and Shanghan Shanghan, cold damage, and modern Western disease concepts such as bubonic plague, meningitis, and typhoid. She also expressed skepticism that this was a viable approach with the following question. Making the perhaps rather large assumption that all these references from the early 17th century to the 20th are to the actual disease entity, is it possible to arrive at any diagnosis? EPID 26. Dunstan was the first historian to begin to analyze Wu Yuxing's treatise on febrile epidemics, 1642, through a more historical, conceptual lens in order to explore the main issues in traditional Chinese epidemiology. Meanwhile, Francis H. Su, the anthropologist who had previously examined what people actually did in response to the 1942 cholera epidemics in Yunnan province, Su, 1952, was by 1975 taking notes during a plague prevention ritual that had been held every 10 years since the 1870s in Shatin, Guangdong province. Su found that the analytic separation between religion and science then current in academic anthropology did not exist in practice. As late as the mid-20th century, Chinese responded equally in religious and scientific ways to protect themselves from cholera in 1942 and prevent plague in 1975, EPID 1983. Su's functionalist analyses of how ordinary Chinese responded to cholera provided a model for studying epidemics, anthropology Cali, comparable to William McNeill's demonstration of the demographic impact of epidemics, as he integrated the role of infectious disease as a key player in shaping world history in plagues and peoples. McNeill, 1976. McNeill united the ecological and cultural dimensions of human experience from the perspective of ecological determinism that supported, for example, his argument that infectious diseases, what he called microparasites, greatly facilitated one civilization, that is, macroparasite, conquering another, as he argued was the case with the European conquest of the Americas. Alfred Crosby developed this ecological determinism further in his The Columbia Exchange, Crosby 1972, and Ecological Imperialism, Crosby 1986. With respect to China, McNeill also adopted Wu Liantai's earlier claim that plague was the cause of the late Yuan epidemics, to support his argument that the Mongolian steppe was the origin of 14th century's Black Death in Europe. McNeill 1976, 132-75, Brooke 2013-65. In one version of McNeill's hypothesis, the Mongol passage through Yunnan in the 1250s was crucial for the plague's transmission to Europe. McNeill 1976, 143-45, Himes 2014-287. The China origin of plague hypothesis immediately engaged historians in debate, starting with Michael Dole's demonstration that even Middle Eastern accounts of plague assumed that it came from the East, Dole's 1977. Norris took issue with this view, Norris 1977-1978, Dole's 1978. Both sides of this debate nonetheless remained within the naturalist-realist epistemology in that neither raised issues with the method of making retrospective diagnoses of plague for past epidemics with a more complex multi-causal epidemiology. As for historians of China, Dennis Twitchett evaluated the effect of epidemics on the population in his analysis of the uneven records for historical demography during the Qing Dynasty, Twitchett 1979. While Dunstan could rely on local gazetteers of the Ming for her analysis of 16th through 17th century epidemics across large geographic distances, there were no comparable Tang local gazetteers. Instead, Twitchett had to rely on contemporary registered population records along with the Tang dynastic history's Treatise on the Five Agents, Wuxingzhi, where epidemics were listed along with other natural disasters. He used these sources to interpret fluctuations in the population as indicative of one of three things: varying administrative efficacy, changing methods of registration by the state, which were highly variable over time, and disasters of war, famine, and pestilence. In some cases, he argued that it was difficult to tell whether the decreased records of disasters, including epidemics in extant sources, reflected accurate records of fewer natural or man-made disasters, or rather problems in the Tang administration's capacity to collect data about their occurrence. He concluded that this discrepancy in the historical records was most likely a combination of both factors. Within a decade, Chinese historical demographers integrated the then current knowledge of China's historical epidemiology with a broad historical overview of China's demography into the history of population in China, Zhao and Zi, 1988. This historical synthesis of Chinese demography may be productively understood within the broader 1980s socio-political context of the one-child policy, which was first introduced in 1979 as a means to control population growth in China. Greenhalgh, 2008. Conclusion: in the century following the 1870s, when lab-based bacteriology began to transform concepts of infectious disease in a way that improved tracking their transmission, to the 1970s, when records of epidemics themselves became useful for tracking other types of change, the natural realist approach to late Imperial Chinese epidemiology developed and came to dominate the interpretation of historical evidence as well as contemporary experience of epidemics. Even before germ theory transformed laboratory medicine, during the Panthay Rebellion of the 1870s in Yunnan, the diplomat Émile Rochet and English physician Patrick Manson had already agreed on a disease concept of plague that was based mostly on clinical symptoms and that could facilitate determining its etiology and transmission pathways. Over the next 40 years, academics and scientists such as Manson, Western physicians writing medical reports for China's Customs Gazette, and the co-editors Jeffries and Maxwell of The Diseases of China, 1910, also made some of the earliest attempts to translate the more multivalent Chinese disease concepts into the more narrowly defined Western medical equivalents. For the next 30 years, the self-styled plague fighter Wu Liantai dominated scholarship on late imperial epidemiology. He had had a key role in fast controlling the Manchurian pneumonic plague epidemic in 1910-11 and in managing cholera during the 1930s when he was the director of the National Quarantine Service, helping track the transmission paths of the plague and cholera epidemics he was charged with controlling. His natural realist perspective facilitated the first retrospective historical epidemiology of plague, stretching back to the Yuan dynasty. This interpretation later became influential through McNeill's contested argument about the Chinese origin of the Black Death. In the next 30 years, from the early 1940s to the late 1960s, scholars began to study the history of epidemics in China as a tool for yet other ends. Xu leveraged his analyses of a contemporary cholera epidemic to challenge the false separation of science and religion in anthropology. The historians Bielenstein, Ho, and Hartwell integrated historical records of epidemics to reveal other social, economic, and demographic transformations in Chinese society. Carl Nathan used the Manchurian plague epidemic as a lens to see how national political crises and global geopolitics intersected in the opening decade of the 20th century. In the 1970s, scholarship on late Imperial Chinese epidemiology started to become more skeptical about making one-to-one translations between traditional Chinese and modern disease concepts. Following Elvin's doubts about being able to identify the late Ming epidemics based on primary sources, Dunstan questioned whether this was even a viable approach. Nevertheless, she suggested that the epidemics were most likely a combination of plague, typhoid, dysentery, and meningitis. Tang records of epidemics were no more illuminating for equating ancient with modern disease concepts, but Twitchett used them effectively to speculate about varying administrative capacities, changing methods of state registration, and fluctuations in population. Just as many modern-day scholars have used historical records of epidemics as a tool for other ends, so too did some pre-modern Chinese commentators. The two accounts of the late Ming epidemics that began this chapter, Chen Qide's political moral assessment and Mr. Shen's social-economic analysis, were rhetorically comparable to what anthropologists and historians began to do from the 1940s through the late 1960s. Both Chen and Shen, for instance, found the late Ming epidemics of their lifetimes to be useful means to illuminate what they perceived to be the underlying social, moral, political, and economic factors, FS, sures and failures that gave rise to them. Even physician Wu Yuxing's criticism of how his predecessors and contemporaries defined febrile epidemics, Wen Yi, as cold damage, Shanghan, rather than warm diseases, Wen Bing, is rhetorically analogous to the natural realist efforts to match past Chinese disease concepts with new biomedical interpretations. The latter translation strategy characterized one of the most important dimensions of the history of late Imperial Chinese epidemiology just over 2 centuries later, from the 1870s through the 1970s. Part 2 picks up the baton in the 1980s when the historicist conceptual approach to the history of disease and epidemics started to develop within the scholarship of medical historians. This new approach shifted historians' attention to changing meanings of Chinese disease concepts and the therapeutic responses they legitimated, both on their own terms and within unique histories deeply embedded within Chinese history. Many of these same disease concepts persist in present-day Chinese medical practices, namely because healers as well as patients continue to find them useful to frame illness experience and determine appropriate therapeutic responses. Notes 1 Zaiwang Jishi Zaihuang Ji She, Record of Disasters and Famines by Chen Qide in Tongxiangxian, Ji Tongxiangxian Ji, Gazetteer of Tongxiang County, 20.9a2, for evidence of blaming human moral failures for widespread epidemics in Taoist thought of the late Han to early medieval period. See HI2 on Demonology and Epidemiology in Strickman, 2002. For evidence of this in European medical history, see Rosenberg, 1992a, 1992b. 3. For Mr. Shen's account of the epidemics in context of broader decline of the economy and social order from 1640 to 1643, see Guianxian Z 27.16b17a4. For a punctuated version of this text, see Appendix in Chen, 1958, 289-91. Primary text in Guianxian Z 27.16b17a. 5. A pickle of rice equaled about 133.3 pounds or 64 kilograms. A tael of silver equaled about 1.3 ounces or 37.6 grams. 1 copper cash equaled a string of 100 copper coins. Although from about 1500 to 1645, the exchange ratio of copper coin to tael fluctuated between 500 and 750. The ratio skyrocketed after 1640 when in Beijing, and especially the Yangtze Delta, it rose above 1,000 to 2,000 copper coins per tael by 1645. For 1640, the exchange ration was 800 copper cash tael. Von Glan, 1996, 160. 6. This figure is also calculated on the 800 copper coins silver tael exchange ratio with 1 tael to 1.3 ounces, 7. This quotation and those following by Wu Yuxing come from his preface to Wenyi Lun. See Wenyi Lun Pingju 2 or Wenbing Shui Quanshu 981. 8. This and the following translation come from Wu Yuxing's preface to the Wenyi Lun. See Wenyi Lun Pingju 1-2 and Wenbing Shui Quanshu 981. Bibliography Pre-modern sources Guianxian Jigui and Xianji, Gazetteer of Guian County, 1882, Li Yixu, Li Yushu, and Luxinyuan, eds. 1970, Taipei, Chengwen Chubanshi. For Mr. Shen's account of the epidemics in context of broader decline of the economy and social order from 1640. 1643, Huan 27, 16b, 17a, Tongxiang Xianji Tongxiang Xianji, Gazetteer of Tongxiang County, 1887, Yanchen, ed. 1970, Taipei, Chengwen Chubanshi, Wenbing Shui Quanshu, Complete Works on the Studies of Warm Disorders, Li Shunbao, ed. 2002, 2 vols, Beijing, Shuiyuan Chubanshi, Wenyi Lun Treatise on Febrile Epidemics, 1642, Wu Yuxing, c. 1582-1652, Critical EDN, by Meng Shujiang and Yangjin, Beijing, Remin Weisheng Chubanshi, 1990, Wenyi Lun Pingju, Critical Notes and Annotations on the Treatise on Febrile Epidem, ICS, Liu Fangzhou, ed. 1709, Frost reprint, 1977, second reprint, 1985, Beijing, Renmin Weisheng Chubanshi, Zaihuang Jishi, Record of Disasters and Famines, 1641, Chen Qide in Tongxiang Xianji, Gazetteer of Tongxiang County, 1887, Yan Chen, AD, 1970, Taipei, Chen, Gwen Chubanshi 128A9A, Zaihuang, Yuji, another record of disasters and famines, 1642, Chen Qide in Tongxiangshan, Ji Tongxiangshanji, Gazetteer of Tongxiang County, 1887, Yan Chen, Eid, 1970, Taipei, Chengwen Chubanshi, 129B10A, Modern Sources Bauer, W. ed. 1979, Studia Sino-Mongolica, Festschrift für Herbert Franke, Wiesbaden, Franz Steiner, Benedict C., 1988, Bubonic Plague in 19th century China, Modern China, 14.2, 10755, Zifar, 1993. Policing the Sick, Plague and the Origins of State Medicine in Late Imperial China, 14.2, 6077. 1996a, Bubonic Plague in 19th century China, Stanford, California, Stanford University Press. 1996b, Framing Plague in China's Past, in G. Herschatter et al., eds. Remapping China, Fissures in Historical Terrain, Stanford, California, Stanford University Press, pp. 27, 41. 1996c. Epidemiology and History, an ecological approach to the history of plague in Qing China, Chinese Environmental History Newsletter, 3.1611, Bielenstein, H., 1947. The Census of China during the period 742 AD. Bulletin of the Museum of Far Eastern Asia, 19, 12563. Borroway, Ida Directoire, 2009. Uneasy Encounters, The Politics of Medicine and Health in China, 1900-1937. Frankfurt, Peter Lang. Brooke T., 2013. The Troubled Empire, China in the Yuan and Ming Dynasties, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Belknap Press of Harvard University Press. Brothwell, D. and Sanderson at EDS, 1967, Diseases in Antiquity, a survey of the diseases, injuries and surgery of early populations, Springfield, Thomas. Kaoshuji, 1997, Shuyi Liuxing Yuhuabe Shehui de Bianqian Shuyi Liuxing, Yuhuabe Shehui de Bianqian, 1580 to 1644. Plague epidemics and social transformations in North China. Lishi Yanju, Lishe, Yanju, Historical Research, 1, 1732. Kaoshuji, and Li Yushang, 2006. Shuyi, Zhenzheng Yu Heping, Zhongguo de Huanjing Yushehui Bianqian, 1230-1960. Shuyi, Zhenzheng Yu Heping, Zhongguo de Huanjing Yushehui Bianqian, 1230-1960. Plague, War and Peace. Environmental and Social Transformations in China, 1230-1960. Jinan, Zhongguo Huabao Chubanshi. Chen Hengli, 1958. Bunongshu Yanju Bunong, Shu Yanju, Research on the Supplement to the Treatise on Agriculture. Beijing, Nongye, Chubanshe, Conrad, Lai and Wujustic, D. eds. 2000. Contagion Perspectives from Pre-Modern Societies, Aldershot Ashgate, Kuta, R. 2004. Framing the End of the Social History of Medicine in F. Huisman and J. H. Warner, eds. Locating Medical History, the Stories and Their Meanings. Baltimore, Maryland. Johns Hopkins University Press, pp. 309-37. Crombie A.C. Eder, 1963. Second EDN, 1977. Scientific Change. London, Heinemann. Crosby A., 1972. The Columbia Exchange, Biological and Cultural Consequences of 1492, Contribution to American Studies, No. 2, Westport, Connecticut, Greenwood Press, 1986. Ecological Imperialism, The Biological Expansion of Europe, 900-1900, Cambridge Cambridge University Press. Cunningham A., 1992. Transforming Plague, The Laboratory and the Identity of Infectious Disease, in A. Cunningham and P. Williams, eds. The Laboratory Revolution in Medicine, Cambridge Cambridge University Press, pp. 209-44. Cunningham A. and Williams, P. eds. The Laboratory Revolution in Medicine, Cambridge University Press. Dolls, M. 1977. The Black Death in the Middle East, Princeton, New Jersey. Princeton University Press, 1978. Geographical Origin of the Black Death Comment, Bulletin of the History of Medicine, 52.1, 112-13. Dudgeon, J. 1871 AA, Report on the Health of Peking for the half-year ended the 31st of March, 1871. Customs Gazette, Medical Reports, No. 1, April-June 615, Shanghai, The Customs Press. Chinese Imperial Maritime Customs Service, 1871-1911. Customs Gazette, Medical Reports. Accessed the 27th of March 2020. 1871b. Report on the physical conditions of Peking and the habits of the Pekingese, as bearing upon health, first part. Customs Gazette Medical Reports No. 2, July-September 7382, Shanghai, The Customs Press. Chinese Imperial Maritime Customs Service, 1871-1911, Customs Gazette Medical Reports, accessed the 27th of March 2020. 1872a, Report on the Health of Peking for the half-year ended the 30th of September 1871. Customs Gazette Medical Reports, No. 3, January-March 79, Shanghai, The Customs Press. Chinese Imperial Maritime Customs Service, 1871-1911. Customs Gazette Medical Reports, hathitrust.org/, access the 27th of March 2020. 1872b. Report on the physical conditions of Peking and the habits of the Pekingese as bearing upon health, second part. Customs Gazette, M. Chinese Imperial Maritime Customs Service, 1871-1911. Customs Gazette Medical Reports, accessed the 27th of March 2020. Medical Reports, No. 4, April-September, Shanghai, The Customs Press, pp. 2942. 1875. Report on the health of Peking for the half-year ended the 31st of March 1875. Customs Gazette Medical Reports, No. 9, October-March 3444, Shanghai, The Customs Press. Chinese Imperial Maritime Customs Service, 1871-1911, Customs Gazette Medical Report. Hathitrust, epidemics.org/, access the 27th of March 2020. 1877. The diseases of China, their causes, conditions and prevalence contrasted with those of Europe. Glasgow, Dunn and Wright. Chinese Imperial Maritime Customs Service, 1871-1911. Customs Gazette Medical Reports, access the 27th of March 2020. Duffin, J. 2005, Lovers and Livers, Disease Concepts in History, the 2002 Joanne Goodman Lectures, Toronto on University of Toronto Press. Dunstan, H. 1975. The Late Ming Epidemics, a Preliminary Survey, Qing T. 3.3, 159. Elvin M. 1973. The Pattern of the Chinese Past, a Social and Economic Interpretation, Stanford, California, Stanford University Press. Fairbank, J.K., Bruner, K.F. and Matheson, E.M., eds. 1975. The IG in Peking, Letters of Robert Hart, Chinese Maritime Customs, 1868-1907, Cambridge, Massachusetts. The Belknap Press of Harvard University Press. Fan Ka-wai, Yu Xinzhong, Chung Hock Ming, and Lao Xing-ga, 2005. Studies on Ming Dynasty infectious diseases, Ming Qing Yanzhou, Napoli, Italy, 13350. Fan Xingjun, 1955. Zhongguo Yufang Yichui, Xixiangshe, Zhongguo Yufang Yi Shuxi Xiangshe. The Intellectual History of Preventive Medicine in China. Beijing, Renmin Weisheng Chubanshe. Fisher, Connecticut, 1995-1996. Bubonic Plague in Modern China, an Overview. Journal of the Oriental Society of Australia, 27 and 28, 57, 104. Floor, C, 1996. The Plague Fighter, Wu Liante, and the Beginning of the Chinese Public Health System, Annals of Science, 53, 361-80. Gamza, M, 2006. The Epidemic of Pneumonic Plague in Manchuria, 1910-1911, past and present, 190, February, 147-83. Gordon, California, 1884. An epitome of the reports of the medical officers to the Chinese Imperial Maritime Customs Service from 1871 to 1882, with chapters on the history of medicine in China, materia medica, epidemics, famine, ethnology, and chronology in relation to medicine and public health. London, Bailliere, Green, MH, ed. 2014. Pandemic Disease in the Medieval World, Rethinking the Black Death, TMG, OC Cashnell, Volume 1, Kalamazoo, Bradford, Arc Medieval Press, Greenhalgh, S. 2008. Just One Child, Science and Policy in Deng's China, Berkeley, University of California Press. Hansen, M. 1997. Inventing a Tradition in Chinese Medicine. From Universal Canon to Local Medical Knowledge in South China, the 17th to the 19th Century PhD thesis, Department of the History and Sociology of Science, University of Pennsylvania. 2001. Robust Northerners and Delicate Southerners. The 19th century invention of a Southern Wenbing tradition in E.H. ed. Innovation in Chinese Medicine, Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, pp. 262-92. 2010. Conceptual Blind Spots, Media Blindfolds, The Case of SARS and Traditional Chinese Medicine in A. Leung and C. Firth, eds. Health and Hygiene in Chinese East Asia. Publics and Policies in the Long 20th Century. Chapel Hill, North Carolina, Duke University Press, pp. 369, 410, 2011. Speaking of epidemics in Chinese medicine, Disease and the Geographic Imagination, London, Routledge Press. Saul, 2017. Visualizing the Geography of the Diseases of China. Western disease maps from analytical tools to tools of empire, sovereignty and public health propaganda. 1878-1929. Science in Context. 30.3, 219. 80. Harley D. 1999. Rhetoric and the Social Construction of Sickness and Healing. Social History of Med-Icene. 12, 407-35. Hartwell, R. 1967. The Cycle of Economic Change in Imperial China. Coal and Iron in Northeast China, 750-1350, Journal of Economic and Social History of the Orient, 10, 102-59, Loayiida, 1982. Demographic, Political and Social Transformations of China, 750-1550, Harvard Journal of Asiatic Studies, 42.2, 365, 442. Ho Ping T, 1959. Studies in the Population of China, 1368-1953, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University Press, H. E. 2001. Innovation in Chinese Medicine, Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, Tsu, Florida, 1952, 2nd EDN, 1973. Religion, Science and Human Crises, a study of China in transition and its implications for the West, London, Routledge and Kegan-Paul, Repro, Westport, Connecticut, Greenwood Press. 1983. Exercising the Troublemakers, Magic, Science and Culture, Contributions to the Study of Religion, number 11, Westport, Connecticut, Greenwood Press. Huseman, F. and Warner, J.H., eds. 2004. Locating Medical History, The Stories and Their Meanings, Baltimore, Maryland, Johns Hopkins University Press. Himes, R. 2014. Epilogue, a hypothesis on the East Asian beginnings of the Yersinia pestis polytomy in M.H. Green, ed. Pandemic Disease in the Medieval World, Rethinking the Black Death, Kalam Azu, Bradford, Arc Medieval Press, pp. 285-308, Imura Kozen Jinkun, Xiaoquan, 1936-37. Chihoshi ni Kisaizara Rataru Chugoku Ekure Ryako, Difangji ni Jizai Seraretaru Zhong Guo, Yili Luekao, Brief Study of Records of Chinese Epidemics in Local Histories. 8 parts, Chugai Iji Shimpo Zhong Wei, Yi Shu Xinbao, New Journal of Chinese and Foreign Medicine. Number 1232 pp 517, no, 1233 pp, 1221, no, 1234 pp, 1424, no, 1235 part 2028, no, 1236 pp 2533, no, 1237 pp, 2528, no, 1238 pp, 2833, no, 1239 pp, 3039, Jeffries, Doh, 1928. The Diseases of China, including Formosa and Korea, 2nd EDN, Shanghai, ABC Press, Jeffries, W.H. and Maxwell, J.L., 1910. The Diseases of China, including Formosa and Korea, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, P. Blackiston's Son, Katz, P. 1995. Demon Hordes and Burning Boats, The Cult of Marshal Wen in Late Imperial Chekiang, New York, State University of New York Press, Kim Young-sik and Bray. F. eds. 1999. Current Perspectives in the History of Science in East Asia, Seoul, Seoul National University Press, Kipley, KF, EDE, 1993. The Cambridge World History of Human Disease, Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, Kuriyama S., 1993. Concepts of Disease in East Asia, in KF Kipley, edi. The Cambridge World History of Human Disease, Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, pp. 52-9, 2000. Epidemics, Weather and Contagion in Traditional Chinese Medicine, in Lee Conrad and D. Wojcicki, eds. Contagion, Perspectives from Pre-Modern Societies, Aldershot, Ashgate, pp. 322, Lau, D.C., Trans, 1970, Mencius, Harmansworth, Penguin, Lei Xianglin, S., 2010. Sovereignty and the Microscope Constituting Noticeable Infectious Disease and Containing the Pneumonic Plague in Manchuria, in A. Leung and C. Firth, eds. Health and Hygiene in Modern Chinese East Asia. Policies and Publics in the Long 20th Century, Durham, North Carolina, Duke University Press, pp. 73-106. Leung, Angela Qiche Liang Chitzi Liang Qi Zi, 1987. Organized Medicine in Mingqing, China, State and Private Medical Institutions in the Lower Yangtze region, Late Imperial China, 8.1, 134-66, Ying, 1997. Shishan Yu Jiaohua, Mingqing de Qishan Zuji, Shishan Yu Jiaohua, Mingqing de Qishan Zuji, bestow charity and transform via education charitable institutions in the Ming and Qing. Taipei, Lianjing Chuban Xia Gongxi, 2010. Evolution of the idea of Chuanran contagion in Imperial China, in A. Leung and C. Firth, eds. Health and Hygiene in Chinese East Asia, Policies and Publics in the Long 20th Century, Durham, North Carolina, Duke University Press, pp. 2550, Leung A. and Firth C., eds. 2010. Health and Hygiene in Chinese East Asia, Policies and Publics in the Long 20th Century, Durham, North Carolina, Duke University Press, Li Shangzhen, Li Shangren, 2002. Natural History of Parasitic Disease, Patrick Manson's Philosophical Method, ISIS 93.2, 206.28, c. 2004. The Nurse of Parasites, Gender Concepts in Patrick Manson's Parasitological Research, Journal of the History of Biology 37.1, 103.30, And a 2010 Discovering the Secrets of Long and Healthy Life. John Dudgeon on Hygiene in China, Social History of Medicine, 23.1, 2137, 2010b. Eating Well in China, Diet and Hygiene in 19th Century Treaty Ports, in A. Leung and C. Firth, eds. Health and Hygiene in Chinese East Asia, Policies and Publics in the Long 20th Century, Durham, North Carolina, Duke University Press, pp. 10931, 2012. A Physician to Empire, Patrick Manson and his Founding of British Tropical Medicine, Taipei, Asian Culture Publishing, 2018. Visualization in Parasitological Research, Patrick Manson and his Chinese Assistants, in Velo and P. Barrett, eds. Imagining Chinese Medicine, Leiden Brill, pp. 457-66, Lowe V. and Barrett, P. eds. 2018. Imagining Chinese Medicine, Sir Henry Wellcome Asian Series, Vol. 18, Leiden, Brill, Lu, D. 2021. History of Epidemics in China. Some Reflections on the Role of Animals, Asian Medicine, Journal of the International Association for the Study of Traditional Asian Medicine, 16.1, Losing, D. 2009. Wu Liente and the History of Chinese Medicine, Empires, Transnationalism and Medicine in China, 1908-1937. In I. Borroway, Eddie. Uneasy Encounters, The Politics of Medicine and Health in China, 1900 and 1937. Frankfurt, Peter Lang, pp. 149-76. Linteris, C. 2016. Ethnographic Plague, Configuring Disease on the Chinese-Russian Frontier, London, Palgrave, Macmillan. Manson, P. 1879. Dr. Manson's report on the health of Amoy for the half-year ended the 31st of March, 1878, Customs Gazette, Medical Reports 2, January-March, 1878, 2527. Chinese Imperial Maritime Customs Service, 1871-1911, Customs Gazette, Medical Reports, accessed the 27th of March, 2020. McNeil, W.H., 1976, 2nd EDN, 1998, Plagues and Peoples, New York, Anchor Books. Mei Li and Yan Changui, 1996. Guan Yu Ming Dai Chuan Ran Bing de Chubu Kaocha, Guan Yu Ming Dai Chuan Ran Bing de Chubu Kaocha. A Preliminary Study of Infectious Disease in the Ming, Journal of Hubei University, 58088. Mitchell, P. 2011. Retrospective Diagnosis and the Use of Historical Texts for Investigating Disease in the Past, International Journal of Paleopathology, 1, 81-88, Naquin S. and Rowski, E.S., 1987. Topics for Research in Qing History, Late Imperial China, 8.1, 187-203. Nathan, C.F., 1967, Plague, Prevention and Politics in Manchuria, 1910-1931. Harvard East Asian Monographs, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University Press. Needham, J. 1970. Clarkson Craftsman in China and the West, Lectures and Addresses on the History of Science and Technology, Cambridge, Cambridge University Press. Needham, J. and Lu Gui Zhen, 1962. Hygiene and Preventive Medicine in Ancient China. Journal of the History of Medicine and Allied Sciences, 17, reprinted in J. Needham, 1970, pp. 340-78. And J. Needham and N. Sivin, 2000, pp. 6794. 1967. Records of Diseases in Ancient China, in D. Brothwell and at Sanderson, eds. Diseases in Antiquity, a survey of the diseases, injuries and surgery of early populations, Springfeld Thomas, pp. 222-37, republished as Diseases of Antiquity in China, in K. F. Kippel, D.R. 1993, pp. 345-53. Needham, J. and Sivin, N. ed. 2000. Science and Civilization in China. Vol. 6, Biology and Biological Technology, Part the 6th, Medicine, Cambridge, Cambridge University Press. Norris, J. 1977. East or West, The Geographic Origin of the Black Death. Bulletin of the History of Medicine, 51.1124. 1978. Response to M. Dolls, 1978. Bulletin of the History of Medicine, 52.11420. Olson, A. and Voss, J. eds. 1979. The Organization of Knowledge in America, 1860-1920. Baltimore, Maryland. Johns Hopkins University Press. Packard, R. 2007. The Making of a Tropical Disease. A Short History of Malaria, Baltimore, Maryland. London, Johns Hopkins University Press, or 2016. The Felding H. Garrison Lecture, Break bone fever in Philadelphia, 1780. Reflectations on the history of disease. Bulletin of the History of Medicine, 90.2, 193-21. Parsons, J.B., 1970. Peasant Rebellions of the Late Ming Dynasty. Tucson, University of Arizona Press. Peitzman, S., 2007. Dropsy, Dialysis, Transplant, A Short History of Failing Kidneys, Baltimore, Maryland. London, Johns Hopkins University Press. Qitao, 1981. Wu Yuxing Liki Shuoqiantan, Wu Yuxing Liqi Shuoqiantan, a superfile discussion of Wu Yuxing's doctrine of deviant qi. Yunnan Zhongyi Shueyuan Zhuebao, the Journal of the Yunnan College of TCM, 478. Rocher, Emile, 1879. La Province Chinoise du Yunnan, the Chinese province of Yunnan. Paris E. Leroux, Rogaski R., 2004. Hygienic Modernity, Meanings of Health and Disease in Treaty Port, China, Berkeley, University of California Press. Rosenberg, C.E., 1962, The Cholera Years, the United States in 1832, 1849, and 1866, Chicago, Illinois, University of Chicago Press, War, 1979. Toward an Ecology of Knowledge on Discipline, Context and History, in A. Olson and J. Voss, eds. The Organization of Knowledge in America, 1860-1920, Baltimore, Maryland, Johns Hopkins University Press, pp. 440-55, 1992a, Explaining Epidemics and Other Studies in the History of Medicine, Cambridge, Cambridge University Press. 1992b, Framing Disease, Illness, Society and History, in C.E. Rosenberg and J. Golden, eds. Framing Disease, Studies in Cultural History, New Brunswick, Rutgers University Press, pp. 3, Rosenberg C. and Golden, J., eds. 1992. Framing Disease, Studies in Cultural History, New Brunswick, Rutgers University Press, Sanderson A.T. Erdős, 1967. Diseases in Antiquity, a survey of the diseases, injuries and surgery of early populations, Springfield Thomas, Scheid v. 2002. Chinese Medicine in Contemporary China, Plurality and Synthesis, Durham, North Carolina. London, Duke University Press, Schipper, K. 1985. Seigneurs Royaux, Dieu des Épidémies, Archive de Sciences Sociales des Religions, 59. 3140, Shichang Yong Shichang Yong, 1956, Zhongguo Chuanran Bingshui Zhongguo Chuanran Bingshui, The Study of Contagious Diseases in China, Shanghai Weisheng Chubanshe, 1957, Shilun Chuan Ran Beng Suijia, Wu Yuke Jiqi Liki, Shueshuo Shi Lun Chuan, Ran Bing Shui Jia Wu Yuke Jiqi Liqi Shui Shuo, an essay on the scholar of infectious diseases Wu Yuxing and his doctrine of deviant qi. Yixueshi Yubao Jian Zaji, Yixueshi Yubao Jian Zaji, Journal of Medical History and Health, 9.3, 186. Strickman SM, edited by B. Faur, 2002. Chinese Magical Medicine, Asian Religions and Cultures, Stanford, California, Stanford University Press. Summers, W.C. 2012, The Great Manchurian Plague of 1910-1911, The Geopolitics of an Epidemic Disease, New Haven, Connecticut, Yale University Press. Temkin O. 1963, Second EDN, 1977. The Scientific Approach to Disease, Specific Entity and Individual Sickness, in A.C. Crombie, Edda Scientific Change, London Heinemann, pp. 629-47, republished in O. Temkin, 1977, pp. 441-5, 1977, The Double Face of Janus and Other Essays in the History of Medicine, Baltimore, Maryland, Johns Hopkins University Press, Twitchett, D.C., 1979, Population and Pestilence in Tang, China, in W. Bauer, Edda, Studia Sino-Mongolica, Festschrift für Herbert Franke, Wiesbaden, Franz Steiner, pp. 3568, von Glan R. 1996, Fountain of Fortune, Money and Monetary Policy in China, 1700, Berkeley, University of California Press, Will P. 1990. Bureaucracy and Famine in 18th Century China, Stanford, California, Stanford University Press, translated by E. Forster, originally published as Bureaucratie et Famine en Chine, 18e siècle, 1980, Paris, École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, Hague, Mouton, Wilson, Esther 2000. On the History of Disease Concepts, The Case of Pleurisy, History of Sciences 38, 271, 319. Wang Cixi and Wu Liente in 1936, History of Chinese Medicine. Being a chronicle of medical happenings in China from ancient times to the present period, Shanghai National Quarantine Service, Wu Liente, Edai, 1936a, Manchurian Plague Prevention Service Memorial Volume, 1912-1932, Shanghai National Quarantine Service, 1936b, Plague, a manual for medical and public health workers, Shanghai Weishengshu National Quarantine Service, Yi, 1959, Plague Fighter, the autobiography of a modern Chinese physician, Cambridge, W. Heffer, Wu Liente, Chun, J.W.H., Politzer R. and U. C.Y., 1934. Cholera, a handbook for the medical professor Sion in China, Shanghai National Quarantine Service, Xiao Defa, 1987. Shilun Wu Yuke Wen Yi Lun de Ju Yao Shui Shu Guandian. Shilun Wu Yu Ke Wen Yi Lun de Ju Yao Shui Shu Guandian. An essay on the principal scholarly views of Wu Yuxing's treatise on febrile epidemics, Jiangxi Zhongyi Yao 2 1 3 Xieguan Xiguan 1935, 2nd EDN 1970, Zhongguo Yixue Yuan Liu, Lun Zhongguo Ye Shui Yuan, Liu Lun on the origins of medicine in China, Taipei, Jingshui Shuju, Yuxinzhong, ed. 2004. Wen Yi Xia de Shehui Zhengju, Zhongguo Jinxi Zhong da Yiqing Yu Shehui Fanying Yanju, Wen Yi Xia de Shehui Zhengju, Zhongguo Jinxi Zhong da Yiqing Yu Shehui Fanying Yanju. Social Salvation During Epidemics, Studies of Serious Modern Epidemics and Social Responses in China, Beijing Zhongguo Shudian, Yuyan, name given as Yun Xiao Yun Shu, 1953, Gudai Jibing Ming Hao Shu Yi Gudai Ji Bing Ming Hu Shu Yi, Glossary on the Names and Symptoms of Ancient Diseases, Beijing, Renmin Weisheng Chubanshi, Zhao Wenlin and Xie Shujun Xie Shujun, 1988. Zhongguo Renkushi, The History of Population in China, Beijing, Renmin Chubanshi, Zhao Xianhai, 2004. Ming Mo Da Yi Yu Ming Wang Chao Di Mi Wang Ming Mo Da Yi Yu Ming Wang Zhao Mi Wang. Epidemics at the end of the Ming and the fall of the Ming Empire in Yu Xinzhong Ede Wen Yi Xia de Shehui Zhengju Wen Yi Xia de Shehui Zhengju. Social Salvation During Epidemics, Beijing, Zhongguo Shudian Pika 49 101. 17. Late Imperial Epidemiology Part 2, New Material and Conceptual Methods, 1980s to 2010. S. Marta Hansen. The previous chapter concluded with two clear themes. 1. Historical actors as well as his. Historians, demographers and anthropologists have wrestled with retrospective diagnosis of epidemic diseases, revealing in the process that disease concepts had complex histories as much in the past as they do today. And 2. Historical actors and modern scholars alike have found epidemics to be useful as a diagnostic lens on contemporary problems, whether as fault lines in the moral economy, as fissures in social order, or as failures in governance. While both of these key themes continue into the present, the scholarship on late imperial epidemiology from the 1980s to the present markedly differs from that of the previous century in terms of both conceptual and material methods. Material methods refers to extant primary sources. Conceptual methods refers to how people interpret them. From late 19th century Western physicians to 1970s historians of Chinese demography, for example, the history of late imperial epidemiology was dominated conceptually by a naturalist-realist perspective. From the 1980s onwards, however, medical historians have increasingly explored late imperial Chinese epidemiology from the historical conceptual side of the spectrum. As for material methods, historical records of epidemics created by Chinese administrators, from dynastic histories to local gazetteers and jottings, religious leaders from tracts on doctrines to rituals and liturgy, and medical authorities, from treatises to case records, constituted the primary source foundation for the former period. From the 1980s onwards, however, geneticists began to develop means to extract human and bacterial DNA, aDNA, from ancient remains and so bring new evidence into the conversations about the global history of epidemics. The resulting new field of paleomicrobiology since the 1990s has analyzed ancient DNA, aDNA, in ways that confirmed, for example, the retrospective diagnosis of a range of infectious diseases from tuberculosis in ancient Egypt to plague in 14th century Europe and influenza in the US during the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. Furthermore, scientific research on the history of non-human diseases and even viruses has developed additional evidence that medical historians may both historicize and integrate into new global histories of disease in non-human as well as human populations. By 1997, one also FNDs the full range of conceptual methods applied to the history of late Imperial Chinese epidemiology when one medical historian applied retrospective DOI 10.432/9780203740262-263 epidemiology to argue that the late Ming epidemics were mostly due to plague, ca. 1995-1997, while I took a more historical conceptual approach to the same epidemics in my PhD thesis and book, Hansen 1997-2011. Finally, this essay reviews the main transformations in scholarship in the past 20 years on both sides of the spectrum. The historical conceptual side dug deeper into historical AC Tours categories, while the naturalist-realist side took a definitive genetic turn. Initially, the two approaches were considered incompatible, Wilson 2000. Yet more recently, some historians are willing not only to wear both hats, Packard 2016, but also to integrate aDNA isolation of the Yersinia pestis in plague victims in Europe into their histories of epidemics in medieval China, where comparable remains have yet to be found, Himes 2014, Brook 2020. These historians demonstrate how syntheses of both sides of this methodological divide allow medical as well as socio-economic historians to switch judiciously between two sides of the spectrum of conceptual methods, namely contextualizing past disease concepts on their own terms and the related responses to epidemics, and also using current scientific criteria not only to identify the infectious cause of past epidemics retrospectively, but also for historical ends related to a deeper understanding of social, economic, and environmental transformations. Historiography of Chinese late imperial epidemiology in the 1980s. 1997 within China. During the 1980s, medical historians also began to integrate the history of disease more into general Chinese history. Frost in A History of Disease in China, Chen, 1981. And then in The New Significance of the History of Disease in China, Fan, 1989, on epidemics, c. 16194-241-4. Both authors began to study the history of epidemics as means to explore questions in social, economic, and demographic history, following more along the anthropological lines of inquiry about Chinese experiences of epidemics that Francis Hsu initiated from the 1940s to 1980s. Hsu, 1952-1983. Christopher Schipper described a Taoist ceremony in Taiwan that occurred every 3 years to protect the community from epidemic diseases. Schipper, 1985. While Hsu's work described one community's scientific as well as religious responses to a cholera epidemic in order to reveal problems with a religion-science binary then prevalent in anthropology, Schipper explained how 3 distinct levels of one Chinese community, the Taoist priesthood, local village chiefs, and the popular or vernacular, attempted to appease the epidemic gods within what he considered to be a coherent religious framework with long historical antecedents in mainland China that persisted in modern-day Taiwan. Both Hsu and Schipper thus explored Chinese epidemic responses in pursuit of other aims, such as demonstrating the inadequacies of Western models to do justice to the social meanings and functions of ritual within Chinese contexts. Their ethnographies furthermore record details of religious and social responses to epidemics that historical documents rarely record and that more naturalist, realist-oriented authors largely disregard. With regard to the history of modern public health in China, Kerry McPherson produced a detailed portrayal of the foreign settlement in Shanghai from 1843 to 1893 and the public health infrastructure foreign settlers initiated. McPherson, 1987, chapter 47 in this volume. She showed that Western medical and sanitary principles were successfully implanted and later fused with Chinese reformist efforts in areas open to Western ideas, especially in Hong Kong and Peking during the 1890s. Taking the epidemiological model developed by British epidemiologist William Farr, 1807-1883, as it was carried out in China as one example, and demonstrating that Westerners negotiated with Chinese social reform diars, McPherson refuted previous interpretations that emphasized imperialist exploitation. Although she applied a symmetric approach to the social negotiation over Far's model among Chinese and Westerners, she did not entertain the possibility that Chinese disease concepts or public health methods themselves might have been relevant to this interaction. In the same year, however, Angela Leung published 2 articles related to China's public health history that did better justice to the longue durée history of Chinese medical governance. The first article traced the transformation from late medieval ideals of state medical governance during the Song Jinyuan period to more privatized medical and charitable institutions during the Ming Dynasty in the lower Yangtze Delta region, Lung, 1987. The second article examined the related evolution of smallpox prevention measures in the Ming and Qing dynasties as a way to examine the broader phenomenon of privatization of medical and charitable institutions. Leung, 1987-88. Meanwhile, to explore the conceptual foundations of Chinese medical thought that arguably underlay this history of state and private medical governance, Nathan Sivin translated a 1970s textbook on Chinese medicine in order to analyze how the meanings of core medical terms had changed from classical times to the 1970s China. Sivin, 1987. When Susan Nakin and Evelyn Rowski wrote in their review article that the history of disease and epidemics was an important new research trajectory in Qing history, Naquin and Rowski, 1987, they captured a shift in the China Feld that was well underway. In response to their question, when epidemic diseases struck, what were the responses of the state and of communities to the crisis? They proposed that the study of the transmission paths of epidemics in the past could help clarify communication and transport networks, migration routes, and levels of social interaction. This review exemplified how mainstream historians saw value in the natural realist angle on China's disease history. Just a year later, Carol Benedict, 1988, analyzed the spread of epidemics of plague from Western Yunnan to the southeast coast microregion during the 19th century, applying William Skinner's macro-region model, predominantly used within Chinese social and economic history, for the first time to Chinese historical epidemiology. See the appendix for map. But she also discussed Chinese disease concepts and various treatments for what clinically appeared to be plague, as well as social reactions to Western treatments and draconian quarantines. Published in the same year, the analysis of the epidemiological transition in Hong Kong, changes in health and disease. Since the 19th century, however, took a public health approach to many of the same historical sources to narrate Hong Kong's epidemiological transition from acute infectious diseases arising out of poverty, food scarcity, and poor sanitation to predominantly chronic diseases under improved living conditions. Phillips, 1988. Applying instead a political history perspective, Carney Fisher, 1988, evaluated the influence of a 1550 smallpox epidemic on Ming-Mongol relations during the Jiajing reign, 1522-67. He demonstrated how smallpox epidemics influenced the Altan Khagan's decision to accept tributary status with the Ming government, for instance, and discussed some of the healing methods for and social taboos created around smallpox. Chinese, for whom smallpox was an endemic childhood disease that granted immunity to those who survived it, were often asked during this period to help take care of Mongols, for whom smallpox was epidemic and thus more deadly for adult Mongols, not previously exposed as were Chinese during childhood. For Fisher, the 1550 smallpox epidemic was an illuminating lens on unique dimensions of 16th century Chinese-Mongol political and social relationships, rather than an occasion to problematize how to identify smallpox in China's past, or contextualize how Chinese conceptualized it then. Other historians nonetheless had grasped the baton of the historical conceptual method and started to apply it to explain the cultural distinctiveness of Chinese concepts of disease. Dean Epler analyzed cold damage, Shanghan, in the first-known Chinese disease monograph, the Treatise on Cold Damage and Miscellaneous Disorders, Shanghan Zabing Lun Shanghan Zabing Lun, by Han physician Zhengji 152-19 CE. Cold damage referred to both its general etiology due to cold, within a configurationist understanding of pathogenic climatic factors, and its major symptoms of excessive heat and cold aversion, Epler, 1988. From then on, cold damage meant both an ontological cause, cold, and multiple physiological signs, heat and cold aversion. This multivalent meaning of cold damage FT's well, medical historian Ause Temkins, 1977, famous distinction between disease as a specific entity, ontological, and as an individual's sickness, physiological, chapter 14 in this volume. Several scholars followed suit along these lines of interpretation in the early 1990s, with chapters for the Cambridge World History of Human Disease that explained East Asian disease concepts on their own terms, Janetta, 1993, Kuriyama, 1993, Leung, 1993. In a historical survey on sexually transmitted diseases in modern China, another scholar discussed some Chinese terms for, and so understanding of, venereal diseases, though within a natural realist frame, Dicotta, 1993. In a comparable vein, Chinese historian Xiao Fan examined an even wider range of Chinese disease terminology from the early to late medieval period that illuminated how Chinese related the environment to local diseases, sometimes making one-to-one correspondences to modern disease concepts, Xiao, 1993. Medical historian Shigehisa Kuriyama, by contrast, took a fully historical conceptual approach to the history of disease in his analysis of the earliest Chinese concepts of pathogenic wind, the human body, and an individuated self, Kuriyama, 1994. Continuing the legacies of anthropologists Su and Schipper, historian Kenneth Dean included a chapter about a cult to a medical god in Taoist ritual and popular cults of Southeast China, Dean, 1993. Similarly, Paul Katz united disease and social history by situating the cult of Marshal Wen, Marshal of Epidemics, within religious communities of late Imperial Zhejiang province, Katz, 1995. Combining both the historical conceptual and the natural realist perspectives, Chang Chia-feng analyzed Chinese strategies of dealing with smallpox, du, lit bean with an illness radical, as part of a range of religious responses to fetal poison, tai du. The main Chinese disease concept that overlaps with the symptoms of modern-day smallpox, Chang, 1995 and 1996A, 1996B, 1996C. But Chinese conceptualized du not as caused by an external infectious agent, but rather as a type of congenital fetal poison internal to all humans that needed to be expelled, Shangdengdu, in order for them to survive into adulthood, which made a great deal of sense, considering that, for at least the Chinese population, it had become a nearly universal childhood disease. These developments in historical conceptual approaches continued during the early 1990s alongside natural realist approaches. Grasping the baton from Nakin and Rowski's proposal to integrate the history of epidemics into Qing history, Carol Benedict argued that the government's responses to plague epidemics during the New Policies period, 1911, helped establish the fast state medical institutions for modern China, Benedict, 1993. Meanwhile, French scholars published a naturalist-realist overview of the effect of epidemics of plague, cholera, smallpox, and leprosy on China, which also explained Chinese medical approaches to understanding and treating them, Liu et al., 1995. In her book on plague in 19th century China, Benedict approached from a more historical conceptual perspective the earlier epidemics of late Ming, Benedict 1996a. She cautioned historians of disease not to assign the biomedical category bubonic plague hastily to epidemics for which there was little historical evidence of either bubo-like swellings or death of plague vector rodents. She combined modern-day scientific evidence of plague reservoirs, animal-based reservoirs of the plague bacillus, with Chinese descriptions of symptoms to determine which epidemics were likely bubonic plague. Two sources of evidence, one biological and the other theoret, Aikao, helped her reconstruct the diffusion of plague from Yunnan in the southwest to Fujian along the southeastern coastline. Developing upon her earlier publications, her book synthesized modern scientific research on natural plague reservoirs in China, with G.W. Skinner's regional systems analysis of economic and social change to determine the diffusion patterns of plague in China from the late 18th through the early 20th century. Benedict, 1996b, 1996c, also separately wrote articles on methodological approaches to epidemiology and history in modern China that clarified for medical historians of China the distinctions that Wilson, 2000, would later call naturalist, realist, and historical conceptual approaches. During the same period, Carney Fisher reviewed primary sources and secondary scholarship on bubonic plague in China from the 1800s through the 1980s without, however, including Benedict's more nuanced mid-1990s scholarship that cautioned, as already noted, against retrospective diagnoses of bubonic plague without specific primary evidence. Fisher, 1995-96. Naturalist-realist interpretation of the end of Ming epidemics as plague. In 1995, the Chinese historian of demography Cao Shuji used McNeill's China origin of plague argument to stitch together a narrative from actual Chinese primary sources to place the origin of plague in Mongolia itself and as the cause of the late UN epidemics of 1344-45, 1356-60 and 1362. Cao, 1995. Cao followed this article 2 years later in 1997 with another one that argued that during the late Ming catastrophes of 1587, 88, 1639-41 and 1643-44, the widespread epidemics in China were also due to plague. Ibid 1997. Cao thus re-examined the evidence for identifying the two waves of epidemics of the late Ming as bubonic plague and, in a few cases, pneumonic plague. His scholarship at that time exemplified what the naturalist-realist perspective could contribute to historical epidemiology. First, he argued that these epidemics were either bubonic or pneumonic plague based on accounts in local gazetteers and modern evidence of natural plague reservoirs in Inner Mongolia, Ibid. Scholars had previously pointed out that it is both biomedically difficult, Dunstan 1975, and theoretically problematic to identify plague without laboratory evidence of the Yersinia pestis, the bacterial cause of both the bubonic and pneumonic forms of plague, Cunningham 1992, 211-19, Benedict 1996, A89. Nonetheless, from textual, ecological and historical evidence, Cao argued for the retrospective diagnosis of bubonic plague in the northern provinces. The local gazetteer descriptions of symptoms such as anode, or hard lump, he, swollen neck, zhongxiang, and boils swelling disorder, gedabing, align with plague, though he included the symptoms of enlarged heads, datu, and obstructed throat, hubei, that do not, and accounts of mortality rates of 40% to 90% and a 2 to 3 day mortality span all suggested to him plague. Cao used ecological and historical evidence to further support his hypothesis of plague in the north. A natural plague reservoir exists today on the Inner Mongolian Plateau, Benedict 1996 A6. Cao argued that it spanned a much wider region during the Ming and Qing dynasties. This reservoir included Mongolian pasturelands just north, east and west of the Great Bend section of the Yellow River, and south along the Great Wall at the northern borders of Hebei and Shanxi, Cao, 1997-28. Although the tarbagan, Mongolian Siberian marmot, also lives across Inner Mongolia, Cao focused on the Mongolian gerbil, Meriones ungulatus, as the more important natural host for the Asiatic flea that carries the plague bacillus in this region, Ibid 27-9. Normally, according to Cao, the bacillus, flea and Mongolian gerbil lived in a symbiotic host-parasite relationship on the Inner Mongolian and Shilin-Boyd UUL plateaus, rarely changing the course of human history. Seen within this broader ecological, economic and social setting, Cao used a broad brush to attribute the drastic demographic losses from 1580 to 1640, mostly to plague. Cao pinpointed the beginning of this process of depopulation by disease in the early Jia Qing reign, 1522-1566, when there was a large migration of Han settlers to the North Shanxi region bordering Inner Mongolia from 1533 to 1534. The Han migrants began the extensive transformation of the region's environment from pasture land to agricultural felds that upset the ecological balance of the natural plague reservoirs, Ibid 28-9. He did not consider, however, the possibility of concurrent smallpox epidemics, Fisher, 1988, to which we will return. A similar process occurred in late 18th century Yunnan, when a large influx of migrant workers arrived to mine mineral deposits and so expanded urban settlements, which led to an increase in intra-regional trade and encroachment on the natural plague reservoirs. With newly opened agricultural lands came an increase in human settlement on the dry plateau and an expansion of markets. This commercial expansion ultimately led to plague outbreaks from 1772 to 1830 in Yunnan. Benedict 1996 A 24-9. One hypothesis is that these socio-economic changes in the region combined to disrupt the rodents' normal habitats, forcing them into new interactions or at least proximity with humans or their domestic animals, increasing chances that people would come into more contact with plague-carrying rodents. In addition, a significant decline in yearly precipitation and the resulting droughts during the reigns of Wanli (1573–1620) and Chongzhen (1628–1644) led to regular famines that weakened human resistance to disease and further expanded the opportunities for rodent-human contact. In such years of dearth, both animals and humans forage for food in new regions, losing their resistance to disease and spreading it as they migrate. According to modern research, people in Shandong during droughts also dug into the nests of the plague-carrying gerbils, seeking the grain they had stored there, and in some cases even eating the gerbils, thereby increasing their chances of dying. Cao, 1997-29. Although Cao did not adequately consider the range of disease possibilities, his focus on the effect of the two waves of epidemics in Shanxi and the North China macro region, Shaanxi, Henan, Hebei, and Shandong, synthesized evidence on the northern origin of the 1580-88 and 1633-44 epidemics that clarified transmission patterns more broadly for epidemics throughout the North China macro region. By applying a naturalist-realist method of retrospective epidemiology to a wide range of sources, Cao sketched an epidemiological picture in the North China macro region in the 1580s and again in the 1630s, 1640s that contributed to the history of epidemics in China. Cao significantly contributed to clarifying transmission pathways, temporal duration, local severity, and range of underlying factors that contributed to the late Ming outbreak epidemics, even if the historical evidence does not yet conclusively support his bubonic plague hypothesis. A naturalist-realist critique of the end of Ming epidemics as only plague, clearly, severe droughts and famines combined with continued Mongol raids, peasant uprisings from 1628 to 1644, Parsons 1970, and Manchu invasions starting again in 1629, Atwell 1988, led to a second wave of epidemics in the North China macro region that were even more complex, widespread and destructive to the population than the earlier 1588-89 epidemics. Cao, 1997-25-6. Manchu military forces finally broke through the Shanhai Pass on the far eastern shore of Hebei province in December 1629, continued their raids through the early 1630s, entered the northern Jili region in the summer of 1636, and so approached the capital in Beijing, Atwell 1988, 629. Despite clear military successes over the previous 7 years, the Manchus then suddenly withdrew from the region. There was, in 1635-36, an epidemic outbreak at Shanhai Pass. Despite Cao's argument that this too was plague, smallpox was a significant concern within the Manchu military, Chang 2002, as it was also for the Mongols in the previous century, Fisher 1988. Furthermore, beginning with the initial rise of Manchu power in the 1610s well into the consolidation period after 1644, smallpox played a significant role in Manchu military and political decisions, Chang 1996A 169-92. Since at least 1613, the Manchus organized their campaigns to avoid contact with smallpox patients. They also distinguished the Mongol and Manchu princes who had survived smallpox from those who had not experienced it. In 1613, the Jurchen chieftain Nurhaci, 1559-1626, decided not to withdraw his troops from Usu, a Yehe Manchu city, despite a smallpox epidemic raging there, because he wanted to avoid spreading it to his other troops. In 1627, and again in 1633, the new Jurchen leader Huang Taiji 1592-1643 of the later Qing Dynasty, or 1626-1636, decided to withdraw Mongol and Manchu princes who had not experienced smallpox from campaigns in both Korea and China, EPID 172-179. As for the epidemic in 1636 on the northern Shanxi border in Yulin Prefecture, the following year it spread further south to Yan'an Prefecture in north-central Shanxi. Datong in northern Shanxi also had an epidemic in 1637. These prefectures were all succiently close to the horse markets along the northern frontier, and the natural plague reservoirs on the inner Mongolian plateau to have possibly experienced plague outbreaks. For the next 3 years leading up to 1640, there was a hiatus in epidemics in 3 of the provinces of the North China macro-region, excluding Shandong. The shift of the peasant rebellions to the southwest in Shaanxi and Sichuan, and south to Henan and Hubei, left Shaanxi, Hebei, and Shandong provinces virtually free of rebel activity from 1637 to 1640. The decline in political upheaval that reduced the numbers of dislocated, moving and homeless people largely explains the break in epidemics, see maps 1013 in Parsons 1970, 59, 61, 67, 73. In 1639, however, another epidemic ravaged the population in Shandong in the region surrounding the provincial capital Jinan. Cao curiously did not discuss this epidemic in his tally of late Ming plague epidemics. The connection between this epidemic and a Manchu retreat similarly weighs against a plague diagnosis. The epidemic broke out shortly after Huang Taiji crossed the Great Wall in the winter of 1638 and raided Shandong by the first month of 1639. Shortly afterwards, the Manchu armies penetrated deep into the central plain and reached Jinan, Shandong, where epidemics broke out in the surrounding region at Qihe, to the northwest of Qihe in Yucheng, and also in Linqing to the east. The historian Frederick Wakeman wrote that it had not been determined whether the Manchus brought the illness with them or turned back because of it. Wakeman, 1985, 143, Effetten 171, Dunstan, 1975, 27-8, Spence, 1990, 24. Yet he still cited the General Zuo Maodi, 1601-1645, who sent a memorial in 1643 from Linqing in Shandong reporting that he estimated 30% died from starvation, 30% from smallpox, and the remaining 40% were forced into banditry in order to survive. Wakeman, 1985, 155, Effender, 216. The Manchus thought that smallpox was one of their greatest enemies. As a natural barrier, it proved more formidable than the Great Wall for Ming military forces. The regent Dogon of the child emperor Shunji, 1638-1661, went to great lengths to protect the emperor from contact with smallpox. Even before the Manchu victory, the child was made to spend long periods in a pox isolation center, Bidusuo, to quarantine him from contact with people who had smallpox. Once the Qing forces had settled in Beijing in 1645, they forced the Chinese who suffered from smallpox to move a dozen or so miles out of the capital. Chang, 1996, A174, Wakeman, 1985, 465-6. Nonetheless, the year after the Manchu entered the capital, on June 6, 1644, a major smallpox epidemic broke out there. Dunstan, 1975-27, Chang, 2002. Long familiar with the symptoms of smallpox, the Manchus had policies to protect those in the ruling family and upper military ranks who had not experienced it as children and therefore had not acquired immunity. It was only after their conquest of China, however, that they began to adopt Chinese variolation methods to protect themselves. Despite such precautions against smallpox infection, the Shunji emperor died from it in 1661. As for the lower Yangtze microregion, the severe epidemic that erupted in 1639 for the first time may have also been due in part to the same smallpox epidemic that hit the Jinan region in Shandong the same year. The 1639 epidemics in Jiangnan do not appear, however, to have been extensions of the northern epidemics of 1633-1637, but rather were the consequence of the combined effects of floods in northern Zhejiang, bad weather in Jiangsu, and locusts in Anhui, all of which contributed to severe famines. Hansen, 1997, 354. The tax increase during that same summer and dearth of foreign silver bullion since 1636 also made it difficult for peasants to purchase rice even when it was available. Atwell, 1988, 632. In 1640, another major epidemic hit Shandong, but available primary sources do not specify its nature, nor do they indicate that a smallpox epidemic continued through the following year. An epidemic erupted again the same year in the northwest and central regions of the North China macro-region with greater virulence than before. This epidemic hit Fengxiang Prefecture to the far northwest of Shanxi, Hejian Prefecture to the east of Beijing, Shunde Prefecture in southwest Hebei, and Jiangde and Huaiqing Prefectures in northern Henan. Instead of coming out of north and central Shanxi, as the Wanli epidemics did, the 1641 Epidemic spread out simultaneously from Hebei and Henan provinces. It subsided in 1642, but struck again in Hebei, Henan, and Shanxi provinces from 1643 to 1644, when, coupled with internal warfare and the Manchu invasion, it took its most devastating toll. Chao, 1997, 23-7. The campaigns of rebel leader Li Ziqing, 1605-1645, in Henan during the spring of 1641 could not have facilitated the spread of the northern epidemics south of Kaifeng Prefecture, where there was a severe epidemic, through Anhui to Jiangsu and Zhejiang in the lower Yangtze macro-region. Although the rebel army and fleeing Chinese in their wake may well have spread the epidemic through major thoroughfares in northern provinces, the rebels neither went far enough out of southern Henan, nor deeply enough into northern Anhui to connect them with the epidemics in the lower Yangtze macro-region. Atwell, 1988, 633. The records describe buboes-like symptoms in northern provinces during the mid-1640s epidemics, Boyle's disorder in the 1643 epidemic in Beijing and surrounding region to the northwest, and hard lumps under the armpits in the 1644 epidemic in Lu'an Prefecture of central Shanxi. The enlarged head epidemics also reached northern Shandong's Binzhou County the same year. Hansen, 1997, 358. Although Cao examined the transmission paths of the 1633-1637 epidemics throughout North China, he falsely assumed that once the epidemic arrived by 1641 in northern Henan and southern Hebei, it rapidly spread south to Jiangnan. Cao, 1997-27. Evidence of buboes-like symptoms, for example, does not appear in the primary sources for the Jiangnan region, though other types of symptoms do. Such clinical symptoms are only found in gazetteers from northern, not southern provinces. The concentration in the northern provinces of buboes-like symptoms indicates that if these epidemics were indeed plague, they probably did not spread south to Jiangnan. The range of symptoms described in the local gazetteers indicates that physicians had not reached a consensus on the character of these epidemics, unlike smallpox and other known diseases. When editors compiled the local gazetteers for each region, they may have borrowed the designation for the epidemic given in an earlier local gazetteer. Furthermore, several accounts of the 1640-44 epidemics in the southern Zhejiang and Jiangsu gazetteers refer variously to sheep's wool heat epidemic, Yangmao and Yangmao 1, sheep's wool clove-like sores, Yangmao Ding, and sheep's wool papulas, Yangmao Zhen, a cluster of disease concepts unique to this time and place that does not appear in any northern record. This phrase appears first in Zhejiang during a 1640 epidemic in Huzhou Prefecture south of Lake Tai, and then again in Jiangsu during the 1644 epidemic in Zhenjiang Prefecture just northwest of Lake Tai. The gazetteer sources are from Wucheng County in Zhejiang and from Dantu, Danyang and Jintan counties in Jiangsu. Imura, 1936-37, num 721. The gazetteer of Wucheng County, for example, records, "In 1640, an epidemic raged. The symptoms were unusual and incomprehensible. It was called sheep's wool epidemic. Strands of sheep's wool would suddenly come up out of foods and fruits. All those who accidentally ate this contaminated food would immediately get sick and die." Imura, 1936-7, number 721. Dunstan, 1975, 24-7. Hansen, 1997, 109-10. With only these scant textual sources, it is not possible after over 300 years to biomedically identify the sheep's wool epidemics in 1640 Huzhou and 1644 Zhenjiang prefectures as plague or any other modern disease category. Nevertheless, clearly contemporaries understood their experience to be unprecedented, nor did they borrow from pre-existing medical terms for buboes. We also FND that smallpox epidemics clearly raged at the end of the Ming in different regions of China, especially judging from how Manchus made considerable efforts to avoid contact with smallpox victims. Furthermore, in the context of severe famines and far from the natural plague reservoirs in Inner Mongolia, some other possible candidates for the late Ming epidemics in the lower Yangtze macro-region are also typhus, one of the most lethal famine fevers in human history, Zinsa, 1934, 159-60, Cartwright, 1972, 1865, and other waterborne infectious diseases such as dysentery and typhoid. To sum up, Cao did not apply a macro-regional systems analysis to examine the possibility of multiple epidemic diseases, as did Carol Benedict. Benedict, 1993, 1996a. Nor was he engaged with her scholarship when he published his. Furthermore, Chang's scholarship on the Manchu fears of smallpox provided further evidence that smallpox, not plague, erupted in Shandong in 1639 and 1643, and then in Beijing in 1645. Cao did not determine whether the same epidemic spread southwards through the cities along the canal and the Yangtze River throughout the lower and middle Yangtze macro-regions. As we have just seen, smallpox certainly and other possibilities seem more likely. Hansen, 1997, 109. This revised naturalist-realist account of the late Ming epidemics argues that a combination of infectious diseases, smallpox certainly something that may never be identified associated with sheep's wool in Jiangsu and Zhejiang, and possibly because of the famine and war of the period typhus, dysentery and typhoid, better explains the range of possibilities for epidemics along the lower reaches of the Yangtze River in the early 1640s. This multifactorial assessment is more complex and convincing than the easier to grasp, but methodologically flawed retrospective diagnosis of plague for most of the late Ming epidemics. Furthermore, by taking a more historical conceptualist approach to the primary sources of the period, we can learn a great deal about how southern Chinese wrote about their experience of the 1640s epidemics, from cosmo-moralistic judgments to political-economic interpretations. One physician's response, in fact, reveals a crisis of confidence in the conventional cosmology that held together Chinese society as profound as their experience of the political convulsions of the last years of the Ming. Historical conceptual perspectives on end of Ming epidemics. A switch to a historical conceptual lens on medical responses to the epidemics from the same period also opens up new avenues of interpretation aiming at very different objectives. As we saw in Part 1, figures like Chen Qide and Mr. Shen had interpreted epidemics in cosmological, social and moral terms. Their contemporary, the Suzhou physician Wu Yuxing, by contrast, took a strictly medical approach to the epidemics of 1641. Instead of interpreting them as manifestations of agrarian crises, excessive taxation, political corruption, moral failures, or the breakdown of the social order, Wu explained them in his preface to the treatise on febrile epidemics, completely within a naturalist framework. While Chen sought moral solutions and Shen worried about paying off debts, Wu criticized conventional treatment methods, promoted experimentation with new drug therapies, and launched an attack on traditional epidemiology through a new understanding of warm diseases, Wenbing. Distinct from the cold damage framework within which warm diseases were originally understood to be spring illnesses due to latent cold acquired during the winter. If we situate his treatise within the social intellectual issues of his time, Wu Yuxing's criticism of traditional epidemiology illuminates aspects of late imperial Chinese social and intellectual history. The broad trend of cosmological criticism since the 16th century clearly informed Wu Yuxing's critique of traditional medical cosmology in the 17th, Henderson 1984, 163-4, Hansen 2011, 92-3, Wusu redefined febrile epidemics, Wen Yi, to which warm diseases belonged as being caused by a kind of deviant qi, Li qi, that did not follow normal seasonal cycles of qi. While Chinese classical medicine understood epidemics to be the result of anomalies in the seasonal qi within a universal agrarian cosmology based on the cyclical changes of seasons, Wu used deviant qi to explain epidemics as the contingent consequence of the local and unclassified qi of a particular time and place, independent of predictable seasonal change. Wu thereby challenged the most basic assumption in Chinese medical theory: the assumption of a system of correspondence between cosmological phases, seasonal cycles, and individual health. His new epidemiology represented a major shift in medical thinking among certain Ming and Qing physicians from a universal cosmological to a local environmental framework. While reading his treatise on febrile epidemics as a naturalist realist would FND little evidence of bubonic plague beyond mention of the subcategory boils swelling disorder epidemics, Gedawen, mentioned earlier in the review of Chow's research. Approaching it as a historical conceptualist opens up many questions about the medical world within which Wu Yuxing wrote his treatise in response to the late Ming epidemics. For instance, Wu was part of a long historical tradition of medical skepticism towards classical medical texts among his predecessors, who found them spatially and temporally limited. The concept of anomalous disorders proved useful for thinking through problems within traditional cosmological categories, but instead of identifying the epidemics he wanted, nest with climatic pathogens out of season, due to northern rather than southern climates, or possibly the pathogenic environment of the far south, Wu newly attributed the epidemics to pathogenic local qi. Furthermore, the chaos of the mid-17th century challenged the intellectual elite, compelling them to re-evaluate traditional cosmology and forcing them to become skeptical towards a regular and comprehensible universe. Henderson, 1984, 171. Comparable to the astronomers of the same period, many of whom had read Western astronomical works that had challenged their Chinese training, Wu also thought that there were fundamental imponderables and irregularities in the world that were not simply due to the limitation of knowledge, though, in his case, without any known Western exposure. Ibid, 248. If boundaries such as those which distinguished each season could not contain the activity of pestilential qi, then such phenomena simply changed irrespective of a regular sequence and were thus temporally and spatially contingent. The order of the universe, according to Wu, was fundamentally varied and unpredictable. Epidemics exposed the weakness of the system of correspondence based on seasonal configuration and opened up the realm of discourse to other ways of explaining epidemics. Henceforth, for those who followed these new arguments within the febrile discourse, the identity of warm diseases became tied to that of epidemics and separated from their pre-virus association as a type of cold damage. Those who continued to align themselves with the cold damage tradition and the canonical formula current, Jingfangpai, associated with it, however, never accepted this distinction. They continued to understand warm diseases as merely one of several possible seasonal transformations of an original underlying cold damage disorder. In the 18th century, physicians who aligned themselves with Han learning, Hanshui, or the return to antiquity, Fugu movement, would in fact harden their position as a defense against the spread of the contemporary formula, Jinfang, or modern formula, Jinfang, currents of learning with which Wu Yuxing would later become associated. Nonetheless, Wu's conceptualizations of heterogeneous, pestilential, anomalous, and deviant qi, as well as his thoughts on the limitations of knowledge, occurred during a period of profound skepticism among educated elites. The traditional medical framework was found to be just as insufficient as the corrupted Confucian classics that formally legitimated state ideology. Wu's critique of medical cosmology had profound effects on later physicians because it exposed the limitations of the cosmology generally and introduced a new way of defining diseases, particularly epidemic ones. It thus became the basis for a new discourse on epidemics in the succeeding 18th through 19th centuries. Hansen, 1997-1998. Asking only natural realist questions about what caused the late Ming epidemics not only limits answers to medical causes, despite even contemporary Chinese accounts to the contrary of multiple socio-political moral causes, but worse, ignores the richer history of Chinese medical skepticism and the broader socio-intellectual trends within which Chinese physicians articulated solutions to perceived limitations within their received medical traditions. Historical conceptual scholarship on the history of Chinese medicine, 1997 onwards, several other scholars have contributed to an expanding trend to contextualize historically Chinese disease concepts. French historians Catherine Despeurs and Frederick Obringer published a book analyzing concepts of the cough, keikususu, that focused on actors' cat allegories in ancient and medieval Chinese medicine, Despeurs and Obringer, 1997. In the history of modern medicine in China, Bridie Andrews analyzed how Chinese physicians first assimilated, as well as questioned germ theory from the 1850s to 1930s through their various translations of the Western disease concept tuberculosis, fei jie he lung tubercular, including the Chinese disease concept, literally meaning exhaustion disorder, Laobing, that corresponded well with the English consumption. Andrews, 1997. Angela Leung carried out a historical conceptual analysis of the changing meanings of the Chinese disease concept numbing wind, mafeng, which had many overlapping symptoms with those subsumed under the modern disease concept Hansen's disease or the outdated leprosy, Leung, 1999. The following year, medical historians published a cross-cultural synthesis of concepts of contagion, Conrad and Wojcicki, 2000, that included 3 relevant chapters. One on Epidemics, Weather and Contagion, argues that although there was contagion consciousness among ordinary people, the scholarly Chinese medical tradition was more weather conscious because of its broader cosmological frame. Kuriyama, 2000. A chapter on the threatening stranger, Keu Wu, unpacks a unique concept of contagion in Chinese pediatrics, Cullen, 2000. And a third chapter on the concept of dispersing the fetal toxin of the body demonstrates how this therapeutic strategy was integral to treating smallpox as a congenital, not contagious disease. Chen 2000. Furthermore, many contributions to Elizabeth Su's 2001 edited volume Innovation in Chinese Medicine can be considered representative of historical conceptual methods. One chapter relates the history of doctrines underlying Chinese epidemiology to Northern Song Intellectual and Political History, Despeurs, 2001. Another presents the history of medical case records as a distinct genre, Cullen, 2001, within which physicians also recorded their responses to epidemics. My contribution charted the 19th century development of a new discourse on epidemics in the Qing Dynasty that took a regional as well as empirical turn, Hansen, 2001. Meanwhile, Leung cast her net even more broadly to examine local medical treatments, Leung, 2001, and the relationship between concepts of disease and concepts of locality, Ibid, 2002. Her later articles on the popularization of medicine in the Ming-Qing period, Ibid, 2003a, medical learning from the Song to the Ming, Ibid, 2003b, and vaccination in 19th century Canton, Ibid, 2008, were not directly on the history of Chinese disease concepts, but essential reading nonetheless for understanding their broader context. A decade after her first article on numbing wind, Leung completed Leprosy in China, A History, Ibid, 2009. This is a historical conceptual longue durée biography of the disease concepts numbing wind and skin afflictions with ugly sores. Li Lai that Leung argued often resembled the symptoms of Hansen's disease, but that had their own unique historical trajectories over Chinese medical history. Just as in the 19th century, the modern disease concept, bubonic plague, became equated with the late 19th century neologism rat epidemics, Shuyi, Benedict 1996a, and beriberi was equated with the 4th century foot qi, Jiao Despite covering a much wider range of symptoms since then, Smith 2008a, 2008b. Modern leprosy has also found equivalents in the Chinese disease concepts Lai, and Mafeng, despite their historically more multivalent and complex meanings. Leung chose to write the opening chapter to the book she co-edited with Charlotte Furt on health and hygiene in Chinese East Asia, Leung and Furt 2010, on the evolution of the idea of Chuanran contagion in Imperial China. With this chapter, she effectively brought insights from her previous biographies of Chinese disease concepts to bear on the longue durée history of Chuanran, the Chinese term chosen in the early 20th century to translate contagion and infection. Since the early 7th century, the second character used the metaphor to die to signify to contaminate, similarly to infection's roots in infeciradi. In the 12th century, the first character meaning transmission is first found combined with die, first to mean contamination via sexual exchange, and then to human dis-ease transmission. But Leung argues that Chuanran cannot be reduced to modern contagion because over more than a millennium it accrued multiple layers of meaning. These include non-human to human contamination, contact with pathogenic environmental QI, non-epidemic as well as epidemic diseases, and even sexually transmitted diseases. Her historical archaeology of Chuanran's multivalency uncovers a finely granulated spatio-temporal terrain of how Chinese articulated disease transmission that cannot be reduced to modern-day contagion. This methodological criticism of one-to-one translations holds as well for the retrospective diagnoses that translate Chinese disease concepts with equally complex historical legacies into modern disease concepts. Yet major breakthroughs in the genetics of ADNA have forged a new path towards doing just this, opening new avenues of research in the process that have brought scientists and historians together in productive new ways. Scientific transformations in the history of plague in China since 2011. During the first decade of the 21st century, scientists applied new methods to determine the genetics of the plague bacillus, Yersinia pestis. Work that proved also to transform historical interpretations of the plague's global trajectory. A major genetic turn occurred in the global history of plague with the full gene sequencing of Y. pestis in 2011 based on ADNA that was gathered from human remains at East Smithfield, London's Black Death Cemetery. This breakthrough solidified arguments that Y. pestis was one of the causative factors in the frost plague outbreak in London from 1348 to 1350 and transformed historical scholarship on medieval plague thereafter, Green 2014-2020. It also stimulated new lines of genetic research on the history of plague in China. Shortly afterwards, Chinese geneticists made more precise claims about the evolution and origin of plague that are particularly important for the Chinese origin hypothesis, Xueto 2013. Summing up this research, historian Robert Himes wrote that their research signals a new departure in the cumulative study of the genetics of the bacillus over the preceding FF years. Himes 2014, 285. Based on genetic evidence, they made bold historical claims that sometime between 1142 and 1339 there was a polytomy, namely the simultaneous or nearly simultaneous genetic divergence of multiple lineage branches from which most of today's strains of Y. pestis developed. Furthermore, they argued that the Qinghai Tibet Plateau was where the bacillus originated. Extending further their research, Himes argued that the polytomy, some call it the Big Bang, that yielded most of Y. pestis' current strains can be placed in space and time in historical sources too, that the polytomy first manifests itself historically in the long destruction by the Mongols under Genghis Khan of the Shia state of the Mi or Tangut people in the early 1200s, and continues with the movement of the Mongols into North China, South China and much of Eurasia, Ibid. Recent hypotheses place the polytomy further west and a bit earlier during the Mongol conquest of Kara-Kitai, Kyrgyzstan, Green forthcoming. The new ADNA methods have strengthened the naturalist-realist approach to the history of plague in China and placed the Y. pestis polytomy in the Qinghai Tibet plateau between the mid-12th and mid-13th centuries. Hymes synthesized this modern genetic research with 13th to 14th century Chinese historical and medical records of epidemics in Central Asia and China, to which he began to apply a historical conceptual approach to how physicians recorded their experience with what they perceived to be a newly virulent epidemic disease, an angle he has pursued more deeply since Hymes 2021. By combining arguments from both sides of the natural realist and historical conceptualist spectrum, Hymes was able to situate temporally the beginnings of the Black Death, arguably one of the most transformative events for global human history, to the 1210s, 1220s period, when Mongols repeatedly attacked the Tangut people of the state of Xia and successfully conquered a state that sat cheek by jowl with what the new genetic evidence is telling us was probably the first home of plague, Ibid 287. Hymes contributed not only an indispensable Central Asian Chinese perspective to the groundbreaking book on pandemic disease in the medieval world, Rethinking the Black Death, Green 2014, but also an exemplary model of cross-fertilization between natural realist and historical conceptual methods of analysis of the global history of pandemics. The conclusion: despite the current resurgence of naturalist-realist approach to history of epidemics in China with recent breakthroughs on genetics of Y. pestis, excellent scholarship from the historical conceptual camp continues to be produced. Hilary Smith's book, Forgotten Disease, Illnesses Transformed in Chinese Medicine, for example, narrates a longue durée history of the multivalent meanings of the Chinese disease concept Fut Chuqi, Jiao Qi, since the 4th CN. Turi to demonstrate that the 19th century conflation of Jiao Qi with the modern disease concept beriberi distorts both China's past medical history and its encounters with Western imperialism in the past 2 centuries. Smith, 2017. Smith asks the reader to consider what does unpacking the history of this forgotten disease Fut Qi reveal about the social, political, and economic changes that Western imperialism brought to East Asia. The following answer that she provided illustrates the pitfalls of retrospective epidemiology. The history of Fut Qi suggests that beriberi outbreaks of the 19th century were in fact a new phenomenon that reflected the rise of imperialism and industrialization just as surely as did the large-scale epidemics of smallpox, typhus, tuberculosis, and malaria in the same period. Reframing beriberi as but one change in Fut Qi's long story highlights the novelty of those 19th century conditions. In this way, the study contributes to the more complex and more accurate understanding that is currently forming of how the modern distribution of power helped shape the global disease burden and how Western medicine reinforced imperial hierarchies at the same time that it relieved some illnesses, Ibid 22. In other words, the modern experience of beriberi was not a feature of East Asian morbidity waiting to be discovered, as many Western physicians had previously argued, but rather a direct result of the spread of Japanese imperialism in East Asia from 1882 to the mid-1920s. As another historian wrote, the history of beriberi in Japan provides a good example of the socio-political issues at stake in the definition of disease and how political contexts shape the production of scientific knowledge about disease, as well as the institutional dynamics that determine policy, Peckham 2016-18. Furthermore, the visual representations of the Third Plague Pandemic project that Christos Linteris directed for FE years of 2013-2018 has resulted in a series of stimulating monographs and edited volumes that combine the history of human with that of non-human epidemics into a new global history of pandemics. The titles alone illustrate their historical and contemporary relevance, from the monographs Ethnographic Plague, Configuring Dis-Ease on the Chinese-Russian Frontier, Linteris 2016, and Human Extinction and the Pandemic Imaginary, Linteris 2020, to the edited volumes Histories of Post-Mortem Contagion, Linteris and Evans 2018, Framing Animals as Epidemic Villains, Linteris 2019, The Anthropology of Epidemics, Kelly et al. 2019, and Plague and the City, Engelman, Henderson and Linteris 2019. Collectively, these books offer some insights into our pandemic present by contributing fresh perspectives on the history of epidemics in late Imperial and modern China, while opening up new vistas onto the history of pandemics in the world. The full range of material, as well as conceptual methods being applied now to the global history of pandemics, in fact, is as inseparable from the history of epidemics in China as it is likely to be inspirational for even more innovative research into the history of late Imperial Chinese epidemiology.